There is a cliff face in southern Iran that has been staring down at the living for over 2,500 years. It rises from the flat earth like a wall the sky forgot to finish. And carved into it, not painted, not scratched, but cut deep into the rock itself, are the tombs of 4 Achaemenid kings: Darius the Great, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius II. Men who once commanded armies so large that historians still argue about the numbers. Men who built roads across continents and bent the ancient world to their will. And when they died, they chose this cliff, not a valley, not a city, this specific cliff, in this specific place, for reasons that archaeologists are still, quietly, debating. The site is called Naqsh-e Rostam. The name translates roughly to Picture of Rustam, a reference to the Persian mythological hero that locals in the medieval period believed was depicted in the carvings. They were wrong about that, but the name stuck anyway, the way names tend to do when a place is old enough that nobody remembers who named it first. What we know for certain is this: the cliff at Naqsh-e Rostam was not chosen casually. The Achaemenid kings, who ruled Persia from roughly 550 to 330 BCE, were not people who made careless decisions about where to put things. These were administrators, builders, men who coordinated the construction of Persepolis, one of the most sophisticated palace complexes the ancient world had ever seen, just a few miles away. When they picked this cliff for their eternal resting place, there was a reason, possibly several reasons, and those reasons connect directly to something older, something that was already at Naqsh-e Rostam, long before the first Achaemenid king ever set eyes on it. Because here is where the story gets interesting. Cut into the lower section of that same cliff, partly obscured now by the later royal tombs above it, is a much older relief carving. Scholars refer to it as the Elamite relief. The Elamites were a civilization that preceded the Persians in this region by well over 1,000 years. They carved figures into that rock, performed rituals at that site, and considered it, by all the evidence we have, sacred ground. So when Darius the Great chose Naqsh-e Rostam for his tomb, he wasn't just picking a dramatic backdrop. He was deliberately associating himself with a place that already carried the weight of deep, ancient reverence. He was borrowing something, legitimacy maybe, or power, or both. That kind of layering, one civilization building on top of another's sacred space, is something you see again and again in the ancient world. But at Naqsh-e Rostam, it's unusually transparent. You can literally see the older carvings beneath the newer ones. The timeline is written into the rock itself. Now, in front of the cliff, standing in the open ground, there is a square stone tower. It's called the Kaaba-i-Zartosht, which translates loosely to Cube of Zoroaster. It's roughly 14 meters tall, built from white limestone, and it is almost perfectly preserved. Nobody knows exactly what it was for. That is not an exaggeration or a dramatic flourish. It is a genuine, documented gap in our understanding. Was it a fire temple, a treasury, a place where sacred texts were kept? All three theories have serious scholars behind them. None of them has been definitively proven, and that tower has been standing there, in front of those royal tombs, for somewhere between 2,400 and 2,600 years, keeping whatever secret it holds. The Selka stone settlement framework places Naqsh-e Rostam in a specific category, sites where stone was used not merely for construction, but for deliberate layered communication across time. The cliff face functions almost like a bulletin board for power. Each king who added his tomb there was making a statement to every generation that followed, and the Elamite carvings underneath were making a statement to the kings themselves. We were here first. This place is old. Respect it. What we cannot yet answer is the deeper question underneath all of that. Why this cliff specifically? There are other cliffs in the region, other dramatic rock faces. What made this one the one? Was it purely visual? Was there a water source nearby that's since dried up? Was there something about the orientation? The way it faces? The way the light hits it at certain times of year? Those questions remain open, and in some ways, that's exactly the point. Stone endures, but it doesn't always explain itself. There is a small town in north-central Turkey, sitting quietly in the middle of Anatolia, that most people outside of archaeology have never heard of. It doesn't have the name recognition of Troy. It doesn't pull the tourist numbers that Ephesus does. But what was pulled out of the ground there, starting in the late 19th century and continuing for decades after, forced historians to push back their understanding of early Anatolian civilization by several hundred years. The site is called Alaca Höyük, and the stone gate foundations at its entrance are, in the most precise sense of the word, extraordinary. The gates themselves, what remains of them, date to the Hittite period, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE. The Hittites were a Bronze Age empire that controlled much of Anatolia and the northern Levant at their peak, powerful enough to go toe-to-toe with Egypt and sign what is considered the world's earliest surviving peace treaty after the Battle of Kadesh. These were not a minor people. They built in stone with serious intention, and the sphinxes that flanked the gate at Alaca Höyük, massive carved figures with human heads and lion bodies, were designed to project exactly the kind of authority you'd expect from an empire that negotiated with pharaohs. But here is what the sphinxes are hiding, in a manner of speaking. Beneath the Hittite construction, the excavations at Alaca Höyük revealed something much older, royal tombs from what archaeologists call the early Bronze Age, dating back to roughly 2350 to 2150 BCE. These pre-Hittite burials contained gold, silver, electrum, and bronze objects of remarkable sophistication, sun discs, ritual standards, figures of stags and bulls that show a level of metallurgical skill that nobody expected to find in Anatolia that early. The people who made these objects are not definitively identified even now. They predate the Hittites by nearly 1,000 years. They were building and burying and creating at a level that simply wasn't supposed to exist in that region at that time, according to the historical models that were in place before the excavations began. So what you have at Alaca Höyük is a site with at least two distinct civilizational layers, each one remarkable on its own terms, stacked on top of each other in the same patch of Anatolian ground. And the stone gate foundations sit right at the intersection of those two worlds. The visible Hittite architecture built directly above and around the older sacred burial ground beneath. The Selka stone settlement classification of this site focuses specifically on those gate foundations and what they represent structurally. The foundation stones are not decorative. They are load-bearing, carefully fitted, and positioned with a precision that reflects serious engineering knowledge. The Sphinx Gate was not just an entrance, it was a threshold, a deliberate boundary between the ordinary world outside and whatever the Hittites considered sacred or protected within. That concept of the threshold, the marked boundary built from stone, shows up at multiple sites in the Selka framework, and Alaca Höyük is one of the clearest examples of it anywhere in the ancient Near East. What remains genuinely unresolved is the relationship between the Hittite builders and the Bronze Age burials beneath them. Did the Hittites know what was under the ground when they built there? Almost certainly yes. Bronze Age burial mounds are not subtle features in a landscape. Did they build there because of what was already there? That is a much harder question. Some researchers argue that the Hittites deliberately chose the site to inherit the sacred authority of the earlier culture. Others suggest the location was chosen for purely practical or geographical reasons, and the older tombs were essentially irrelevant to the decision. The honest answer is that we don't know. The written record the Hittites left behind, substantial as it is, they were prolific record keepers on clay tablets, does not address Alaca Höyük specifically in ways that resolve this question. The stone speaks more clearly than the texts do in this case. There is one more detail worth sitting with. The sphinxes at the gate are not originals. The originals were removed during excavation and are now split between two museums, one in Ankara, one in Berlin. What stands at the site today are reproductions, which means the gate, as visitors see it now, is itself a kind of reconstruction, a copy of a threshold that was built above a world that was already ancient when the Hittites arrived. Layers beneath layers, stone beneath stone. That pattern, it turns out, is only getting started. Sometime around 1902, a construction crew in the town of Paola, on the small Mediterranean island of Malta, was digging foundations for a new housing development. Routine work, the kind of thing that happens in growing towns without much ceremony. And then one of their tools broke through into something below, a hollow space, then another, then a network of chambers carved entirely out of living rock, descending in 3 distinct levels into the earth beneath them. The workers, by most accounts, kept quiet about it for several years. The full scope of what they had found didn't reach archaeologists until around 1907. By that point, some of the upper chambers had already been disturbed. What remained, however, was enough to stop the archaeological community cold. The site is called the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum. The word hypogeum simply means underground structure in Greek, but that word does almost nothing to prepare you for what the place actually is. This is not a cave. It is not a natural formation that people later adapted. Every chamber, every corridor, every curved ceiling and carved niche in the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum was cut by human hands, using tools made of stone and bone and antler, somewhere between 3,600 and 2,500 BCE. That places its construction before Stonehenge, before the pyramids at Giza, before most of the structures that tend to anchor our mental picture of the ancient world. The 3 levels descend to about 10 meters below the surface. The uppermost level appears to be the oldest, carved into natural cave formations that were then expanded and refined. The middle level is where the craftsmanship becomes, frankly, startling. Chambers here were cut with a precision and deliberateness that goes well beyond functional necessity. One room in particular, called the Oracle Room, has an acoustic property that researchers have spent considerable effort studying. A low male voice, spoken or chanted from a specific niche in that room, resonates through the entire hypogeum at a frequency of around 110 Hz. The sound doesn't just echo, it fills the space in a way that is, by multiple accounts from people who have experienced it firsthand, physically felt as much as heard. Was that intentional? Did the builders of the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum design the Oracle Room specifically to produce that acoustic effect? That is not a question with a clean answer. Some acoustic archaeologists argue yes, that the 110 Hz frequency was deliberately engineered, possibly to induce specific neurological states during ritual use. Research has shown that sound at that frequency can affect brain activity, producing responses in the areas associated with altered consciousness and deep memory. Others are more cautious, noting that we cannot confirm intentionality without written or pictorial evidence that the builders understood what they were creating. The Maltese temple builders left no written language. Their intentions have to be inferred entirely from what they built. What we do know is that the Hypogeum was used for a significant period as a burial site. The remains of approximately 7,000 individuals were found across its chambers. 7,000. On an island that, at the time of the Hypogeum's use, had a total population that was almost certainly far smaller than that number suggests. The dead were placed here over generations, possibly centuries, in what appears to have been an organized and deliberate funerary practice. Ochre, red pigment, was found on many of the remains and on the chamber walls. Figurines were found, including one of the most debated objects in Maltese archaeology, a small, sleeping figure, often called the Sleeping Lady, whose posture and craftsmanship suggest a ritual significance that nobody has fully explained. The Selka stone settlement framework positions the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum as one of the most significant examples of intentional subterranean stone shaping in the ancient world. Not because it is the largest, it isn't, but because the relationship between the space, the stone, the sound, and the dead who were placed there suggests a coherent worldview being expressed in 3 dimensions: underground, in the dark. These were not people simply disposing of their dead. They were constructing an architecture of belief, and they were doing it in stone, beneath the earth, in a way that was meant to last. It has lasted 5,000 years and counting. What remains unanswered is the larger question of the culture that built it. The Maltese temple builders appear, and then, around 2500 BCE, disappear from the archaeological record with an abruptness that is itself unexplained. No clear evidence of invasion. No obvious environmental catastrophe on the scale that would account for it. They built something extraordinary, and then they were simply gone. There is a hill in Aberdeenshire, in the northeast of Scotland, that on a clear day gives you a view stretching for miles in every direction. The hill is called Tapo Noth. It rises to about 563 meters above sea level, which in Scottish terms is not exceptional. There are higher hills, more dramatic hills, but Tapo Noth has something on its summit that very few hills anywhere in the world can claim. The remains of a vitrified hill fort, a stone structure so intensely heated at some point in its history that the rock itself melted and fused together into a glassy, slag-like mass. And recent excavations have revealed that what sits beneath and within that vitrified outer wall is one of the largest prehistoric hill forts ever identified in Scotland, possibly in all of Northern Europe. The numbers, when they came in, genuinely surprised the archaeologists running the dig. The excavation that brought Tapo Noth back into serious academic focus was led by a team from the University of Aberdeen, with results published around 2020 and 2021. Using a combination of traditional excavation and modern survey techniques, they identified evidence of around 4,000 pit houses, structures dug partially into the ground and covered with organic roofing material, clustered on and around the hill fort. 4,000. If that number holds up under further analysis, and researchers are still working through the implications, Tapo Noth was not a small defensive outpost or a seasonal gathering place. It was, at least at some point in its history, a substantial settlement, a community large enough that calling it a town, by the standards of its era, is not unreasonable. The dating is where things get complicated and genuinely interesting. The vitrified wall, that fused, glassy outer fortification, appears to date to the Iron Age, roughly the 1st millennium BCE. But some of the evidence from the pit houses suggests activity at the site stretching back considerably further. The full chronology of Tapo Noth is still being assembled, and it is likely to take years of additional work before the picture is clear. What researchers are already confident about is that this site was used, returned to, and built upon across a significant span of time. It was not a single-moment construction. It grew, it changed, and at some point, something happened to its outer wall that subjected the stone to temperatures high enough to cause vitrification. That last point is worth slowing down on. Vitrified forts are found at roughly 50 sites across Scotland and a handful of other locations in Europe. The vitrification is real and documented. The stone genuinely melted. What is not agreed upon is how or why. The two main explanations that have been seriously debated among researchers are these. First, that the vitrification was accidental, the result of the fort being set on fire by attackers, with the timber laced through the stone walls, burning hot enough and long enough to melt the rock. Second, that the vitrification was intentional, that the builders themselves set fire to the walls deliberately, possibly to strengthen the structure, possibly for ritual reasons, possibly both. The problem with the first theory is a structural one. Experiments attempting to replicate accidental vitrification through attack fires have generally struggled to produce the sustained, even temperatures that the actual vitrified forts display. The problem with the second theory is the obvious question it raises. Why would you deliberately destroy the integrity of your own defensive wall, even partially? And what would the ritual logic behind such an act look like? Neither explanation has been definitively ruled out, and there is a third possibility that some researchers have raised more quietly, that the vitrification occurred not during the life of the fort, but after its abandonment, for reasons that had nothing to do with the original inhabitants. That theory has its own problems, not least the question of who would have bothered. The Selka stone settlement classification of Tapo Noth focuses on the stone core of the hill fort structure, the foundation and inner construction that predates or underlies the vitrified outer wall. That core represents a level of organized labor and site planning that, given the scale now emerging from the excavations, was considerably more sophisticated than the site's relatively obscure reputation would suggest. Scotland has no shortage of prehistoric monuments, but Tapo Noth, sitting on its windy summit in Aberdeenshire, keeps producing evidence that pushes the boundaries of what we assumed about the scale and complexity of Iron Age and pre-Iron Age communities in northern Britain. 4,000 pit houses on a Scottish hilltop. That is not a footnote. That is a city waiting to be understood. There is a place in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta Mountains of northern Colombia that the outside world did not know existed until 1972. And even then, the people who found it first were not archaeologists, they were looters. A group of treasure hunters working their way through dense jungle came across stone terraces emerging from the hillside, connected by ancient stairways, partially consumed by centuries of vegetation. They pulled artifacts from the site and began selling them on the black market in Santa Marta. The objects were unusual enough and valuable enough that word eventually reached Colombian authorities and then archaeologists. By 1976, a formal excavation was underway. What they found was a city, not a ceremonial outpost, not a seasonal camp. A city built on a steep jungle mountainside, covering roughly 30 hectares, with hundreds of terrace platforms connected by a network of stone paths and stairways. The local indigenous people, the Kogi, already knew it was there. They had always known. They called it Tairona. The name Ciudad Perdida, the lost city, came later from the outside world that had simply failed to look. The lower terraces at Ciudad Perdida are where much of the most significant structural evidence sits, and they are the focus of the Selcha stone settlement classification of this site. These terraces were not carved from the mountain passively. They represent an enormous and sustained engineering effort, stone retaining walls built to hold flat platforms against a slope that drops sharply through tropical rainforest toward the Buritaca River below. The precision of the construction matters here. These walls were built without mortar. The stones were shaped and fitted against each other in a way that has allowed them to withstand centuries of heavy rainfall, root intrusion, seismic activity, and the relentless biological pressure of one of the most aggressive ecosystems on Earth. Many of them are still structurally sound today. The builders were the Tairona people, a civilization that flourished in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta from at least the first millennium CE. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the site places the construction of Ciudad Perdida at around 800 CE, though some researchers believe activity in the area began earlier. The Tairona were sophisticated in ways that their relative obscurity in popular history doesn't reflect. They built extensive road networks through the mountains. They managed water through a system of drainage channels integrated into their terraced construction. They maintained trade relationships with other cultures across the region. And they built their primary city not in a valley or on a coast where access would be easy, but high in a mountain range that required days of difficult travel to reach even today, with marked trails and modern gear. Why there? That question sits at the center of what makes Ciudad Perdida genuinely puzzling as a settlement choice. The Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is not an easy place to live. The lower terraces in particular, despite their engineering quality, occupy terrain that demanded constant maintenance against the jungle's efforts to reclaim them. The Tairona clearly had both the labor force and the organizational capacity to build almost anywhere in their territory. They chose the high mountains. The prevailing explanation among researchers is defensive, that the elevation and the difficulty of access provided natural protection. But the Kogui, the descendants of the Tairona who still live in the Sierra Nevada today, offer a different framing. For them, Tairona is not primarily a defensive site. It is a sacred one. The Sierra Nevada is, in their cosmology, the heart of the world. Building there was not a strategic calculation. It was an obligation. That tension between the archaeological interpretation and the indigenous understanding of the same place is one that runs through the Ciudad Perdida literature and has no clean resolution. Both frameworks contain real information. They just organize it differently. What the lower terraces show, structurally and materially, is a community that understood its landscape with extraordinary intimacy. The drainage systems built into the terrace walls account for the specific rainfall patterns of the Sierra Nevada in ways that suggest generations of observation and accumulated knowledge translated directly into construction decisions. This was not trial and error building. This was informed, deliberate engineering rooted in deep environmental knowledge. The Spanish conquest disrupted the Tairona catastrophically in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Ciudad Perdida was abandoned. The jungle moved in quickly, as jungle does, but the lower terraces held. Stone fitted against stone, without mortar, on a steep Colombian mountainside for over 1,000 years. The jungle never fully won. There is a bend in the Usumacinta River, on the border between what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala, where the jungle comes down hard to the water's edge on both sides, and the air sits heavy and green and close. In that bend, on the Mexican side, the ancient Maya city of Yaxchilán occupies a limestone promontory that the river wraps around on 3 sides like a natural moat. To reach it today, you take a boat. You always had to take a boat, or cross at a specific shallow point that the Maya controlled. That geography was not accidental. The people who built Yaxchilán understood exactly what the river gave them, and they built accordingly for centuries. Most visitors who make the journey to Yaxchilán come for the major structures: the main plaza, the grand staircases, the elaborately carved lintels above the doorways of the principal buildings, which are among the finest examples of Maya stone carving anywhere in the world. Those lintels tell stories, dynastic histories, ritual events, the names and deeds of rulers carved with a specificity and artistry that still stops people cold when they stand in front of them. They are remarkable. But the Selka stone settlement framework directs attention elsewhere, at Yaxchilán, to the lesser structures, the smaller buildings scattered across the site's multiple levels, the constructions that receive less scholarly attention and far fewer photographs, but which taken together reveal something about how this city actually functioned on a daily basis that the grand monuments don't show you. Yaxchilán was occupied and developed across a long period, with its peak influence running roughly from 250 to 900 CE, during what archaeologists call the Classic Maya period. At its height, it was a regional power, controlling trade along the Usumacinta and maintaining complex political relationships, sometimes alliances, sometimes violent rivalries, with neighboring cities, including Piedras Negras and Palenque. The ruling dynasty that left the most visible mark on the city was associated with a series of kings whose names, reconstructed from the carved inscriptions, include Shield Jaguar the Great and Bird Jaguar the Fourth. These were not ceremonial figureheads. They were active political and military operators whose decisions shaped the city's physical form as much as its political fortunes. The lesser structures at Yaxchilán are distributed across a series of natural and modified terraces that step up from the river level into the higher ground behind. Many of these buildings have not been fully excavated. Some have been stabilized against collapse, but not cleared. Others are still partially buried under centuries of accumulated organic material and root systems. What the work that has been done reveals is a construction vocabulary that is consistent across the site. Limestone blocks cut and fitted with care, corbelled vault roofing systems, doorways oriented with deliberate attention to sight lines and solar events, but applied at varying scales depending on the function and status of each structure. Here is what makes the lesser structures specifically interesting in the context of the Selka framework. The major buildings at a Maya site, like Yaxchilán, were built to impress, to project power, to anchor ritual events that the entire community participated in. Their scale and ornamentation reflect their public function. The lesser structures had different jobs. Some appear to have been residential, housing the intermediate class of administrators, scribes, and craft specialists that kept a city of Yaxchilán's complexity operating. Others show evidence of specialized production or storage. A few have interior arrangements that suggest ritual use at a smaller, possibly more private scale than the grand temple ceremonies conducted in the main plaza. That diversity of function, expressed through variations in the same basic stone construction tradition, is what the Selka classification is tracking. The lesser structures are where the texture of daily life at Yaxchilán is most legible, precisely because they weren't built for an audience. They were built to be used. The collapse of Yaxchilán, like the collapse of the broader classic Maya civilization across the lowlands, happened with a speed that still puzzles researchers. By around 900 CE, the city appears to have been largely abandoned. The last dated monument at the site was carved in 808 CE. After that, silence. The theories are familiar from other Maya collapse discussions: prolonged drought, agricultural exhaustion, political fragmentation, warfare. Probably some combination of all of them, in proportions that shifted across different regions and different decades. But here is the question that the lesser structures quietly raise. When the city emptied, where did those people go? The administrators, the craftspeople, the families who lived in those smaller stone buildings on the terraces above the river. There is a site in the Tlacolula Valley of Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, that occupies a rocky hillside above the valley floor with the particular kind of quiet authority that old places sometimes carry. The valley itself is one of the arms of the broader Oaxaca Valley system, a landscape that has supported continuous human settlement for thousands of years and that produced, among other things, the Zapotec civilization, one of the earliest complex societies in Mesoamerica, predating the better-known Aztec and Maya cultures by centuries. The site is called Yagul, and while it contains a substantial archaeological complex, including a ball court, palace structures, and one of the largest group tomb systems in the Oaxaca Valley, the Selka stone settlement framework focuses on something more specific: the astronomical orientation evidence embedded in Yagul's stone construction, and what that evidence says about the people who built here and the sky they were watching. Yagul was occupied across a long span, with its most significant development occurring during the late pre-classic and classic periods, roughly 500 BCE to 900 CE, though occupation of the broader area stretches back considerably further. The site sits at an elevation that gives it commanding views of the surrounding valley, and its relationship to the nearby major Zapotec center of Mitla is close enough, geographically and culturally, that the two sites are often discussed together. But Yagul has its own character. It is smaller than the great Zapotec capital of Monte Alban, less visually dramatic than Mitla's famous geometric stone mosaic facades. What it has, and what makes it significant in the context of this series, is a specific and well-documented piece of astronomical architecture that connects it to a tradition of sky observation that runs deep through Zapotec culture. The Zapotec were serious astronomers. That is not a romantic projection. It is documented in their architecture, their calendar systems, and their careful orientation of major structures relative to celestial events. Monte Alban contains a building known as Building J, arrow-shaped and oriented in a way that is clearly non-standard for the site, which researchers have convincingly argued was designed as an astronomical observation point, aligned to specific stellar events. The Zapotec tracked the movements of Venus with particular intensity, and their understanding of the solar year was precise enough to be encoded in the physical layout of their ceremonial centers. At Yagul, the astronomical evidence is expressed differently. The site's principal structures are oriented with attention to solar events and the positioning of specific architectural elements, doorways, sight lines, through aligned openings. The relationship between structures and the natural horizon reflects the same tradition of encoding celestial knowledge into built form that appears at other Zapotec sites. What researchers studying Yagul's observatory function have focused on is the way the stone construction mediates between the human observer and the sky. You are not simply standing in an open field, watching the sun rise. The architecture frames the event. It tells you where to stand, and when, and what to look for. That framing function of the stone is what the Selka classification is tracking here. The lesser-studied astronomical orientation evidence at Yagul represents a use of stone that is neither purely defensive, nor purely residential, nor purely ceremonial in the conventional sense. It is instructional. The stone is arranged to teach, or more precisely to preserve and transmit, a specific body of knowledge about the sky and its relationship to time, agriculture, ritual, and political authority. Because astronomical knowledge in Mesoamerican cultures was not a purely intellectual pursuit. It was power. The ability to predict the movements of the sun and Venus and the timing of the rainy season was the ability to coordinate planting, to time rituals, to legitimate the authority of rulers who presented themselves as mediators between the human world and the celestial one. The people who controlled astronomical knowledge controlled something essential, and they built that knowledge into stone so it could not be lost to the death of any individual keeper. The broader Tlacolula Valley contains multiple sites with astronomical orientation evidence, and Yagul sits within that landscape as one node in a larger network of sky-watching architecture. How these sites related to each other, whether there was active coordination among astronomical observers across different communities, or whether each site independently arrived at similar orientations through shared cultural tradition, is a question the evidence doesn't fully answer. There is a structure sitting in the middle of the Sardinian countryside near the small town of Barumini that has been visible on the landscape for roughly 3,000 years. It is not hidden. It is not buried. It sits in open farmland, broad and heavy and unmistakable, built from dark basalt stone, without mortar, without written instructions, without any blueprint that has ever been found. The locals always knew it was there. For a long time, the broader world simply didn't pay attention. That changed in the 1950s, when an archaeologist named Giovanni Liliu led a systematic excavation of the site and pulled back enough of the accumulated earth and debris to reveal the full scale of what had been sitting in plain sight all along. The structure is called Nuraxi su Nuraxi. In 1997, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it remains, despite decades of study, one of the most architecturally distinctive and culturally puzzling monument types in all of prehistoric Europe. A nuraga and su Nuraxi is the finest example of thousands scattered across Sardinia, is a type of stone tower unique to the island. The word itself is ancient, possibly pre-Indo-European in origin, which is itself a clue about the depth of the culture that produced these structures. There are somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 nuraghi on Sardinia, depending on how you count partial remains. That density is extraordinary. No other region on Earth has anything quite like it. The towers were built primarily during the Nuragic period, which runs roughly from 1900 to 700 BCE. though the culture that built them persisted in various forms well beyond that. Nuraxi is among the oldest and most complex of the surviving examples, with a central tower that dates to around 1700 BCE and a surrounding bastion and village that developed over subsequent centuries. The central tower at Nuraxi rises to about 15 meters today, though it was almost certainly taller in its original form. It was built using a technique called Cyclopean masonry, large irregular stones fitted together without mortar in a way that relies entirely on the weight and geometry of the stones themselves for structural integrity. The interior of the tower contains corbelled chambers stacked vertically, connected by internal staircases cut into the walls. The construction is sophisticated in a way that is easy to underestimate when you're looking at it from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a very large pile of dark stone. From the inside, it is a carefully engineered vertical space that has held its form for nearly 4,000 years. What was it for? That question has generated a substantial body of research and a range of competing answers. The defensive interpretation is the most straightforward. The towers are tall, they have commanding views of the surrounding landscape, and their thick walls would have made them extremely difficult to attack with the technology available during the Bronze Age. But defense alone doesn't account for the density of nuraghi across Sardinia, many of which are positioned within sight of each other in patterns that suggest a coordinated territorial network rather than individual fortifications. Some researchers have proposed that the towers functioned as chieftains' residences, combining defensive, administrative, and ceremonial functions in a single structure. Others have focused on the intervisibility between towers, suggesting a signaling network that allowed rapid communication across large distances. The village that grew up around Nuraxi adds another layer to the interpretation problem. Excavations revealed a complex of round stone huts surrounding the central tower and its bastion, with evidence of metalworking, food storage, and what appears to be communal activity spaces. This was not a fortress with a small garrison. It was a community organized around the central tower in a way that made the tower both a practical and a symbolic anchor for daily life. The Nuragic people left no deciphered written language. Their beliefs, their social organization, their understanding of the towers they built with such consistency and care across an entire island, all of it has to be reconstructed from material evidence alone. Bronze figurines found at Nuragic sites show warriors, athletes, priests, boats, and animals, offering fragmentary glimpses of a visual culture that was clearly rich and varied. But the figurines raise as many questions as they answer. What is clear, at Nuraxi specifically, is that the stone was chosen and placed with intention at every stage of the structure's long development. Each addition to the original tower reflects a community that understood what it had inherited and chose to build on it, rather than replace it. 3,000 years of Sardinian wind have not moved a single stone out of place. That is not luck, that is knowledge, built in. There is a site in the highlands of Ecuador, sitting at roughly 3,200 meters above sea level in the Cañar province, where the wind comes off the Paramo grasslands in long, cold sweeps, and the sky feels closer than it should. The site is called Ingapirka. Most people who know it at all know it for the Inca construction at its center, an elliptical stone platform called the Temple of the Sun, built with the fitted stone precision that the Inca are famous for, oriented to catch the light of the solstice sun in specific and deliberate ways. That structure gets the photographs, It gets the guidebook descriptions. It anchors the site's identity in the popular imagination as an Inca monument. But Ingapirka is not simply an Inca site, and the lesser structures surrounding that central platform tell a story that is, in certain respects, more complicated and more revealing than the temple itself. Before the Inca arrived in this part of the Andes, the Cañar region was home to the Cañari people, a distinct culture with their own language, their own traditions, and their own long relationship with this specific landscape. The Cañari had been building at and around Ingapirka before the Inca expansion reached them in the latter half of the 15th century. When the Inca incorporated the Cañari into their empire, they did what the Inca characteristically did. They built on top of, alongside, and in dialogue with what was already there. The result at Ingapirka is a physical layering of two distinct architectural traditions occupying the same hilltop, which is what makes the lesser structures so significant to the Selkirk stone settlement analysis of this site. The Inca construction at Ingapirka is immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with sites like Machu Picchu or Ollantaytambo. The stones are cut with extraordinary precision, fitted together without mortar in joints so tight that the blade of a knife cannot be inserted between them. The elliptical platform is the clearest example of this at the site, and its solar orientation has been confirmed through archaeoastronomical study. The structure is aligned so that during the June solstice, sunlight enters specific openings and illuminates the interior in ways that cannot be accidental. The Inca understanding of solar movement and their ability to encode that understanding in stone construction is well documented across their empire, and Ingapirka is a clean example of that tradition applied at the empire's northern edge. The lesser structures are different in character. Some of them reflect Cañari construction methods, less precisely fitted, using locally available stone in ways that prioritize function over the geometric perfection the Inca prized. Others appear to represent hybrid construction, where Inca and Cañari techniques are visible in the same building, suggesting a period of transition or collaboration between the two traditions. Rectangular enclosures, storage facilities, and what appear to be residential structures are distributed across the hilltop in a spatial arrangement that researchers are still mapping and interpreting. Some of these structures have been excavated, many have not. What the lesser structures reveal, when examined as a group, is that Ingapirka was a functioning community and administrative center, not simply a ceremonial site. The Inca used it as a tambo, a way station along the royal road system that connected the empire from what is now Colombia to central Chile. Travelers, soldiers, and goods moved through this high Andean hilltop. People lived here, worked here. The lesser structures are where that daily administrative and residential life was conducted, while the Temple of the Sun anchored the site's ceremonial identity. The Cañari dimension of Ingapirka is the part that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Archaeological work at the site has identified Cañari ceramics, burial practices, and construction elements that predate the Inca period and establish this hilltop as a place of significance long before the empire arrived. The Cañari relationship with Ingapirka was not erased by the Inca presence. It was complicated by it, absorbed into it, and in some ways preserved by it, because the Inca chose to build at a place the Cañari already considered important. That pattern should feel familiar by now. It has appeared at nearly every site in this series. Sacred ground accumulates. Cultures arrive, find something already there, and choose to add their own layer rather than start fresh somewhere else. Why? Is it purely practical? These hilltops and riverbanks and cliff faces were simply good locations that independent cultures kept recognizing as such? Or is something else being transmitted across generations, some understanding of place that persists even when the people who first held it are gone? Ingapirka sits at 3,200 meters and offers no easy answers. In 2011, a team of Chinese archaeologists working in the Shanxi province of northern China began to fully reckon with something that had been sitting in plain sight, partially misidentified, for years. A large earthen mound in the Mu'as Desert region, long assumed to be a remnant of the Great Wall's later construction phases, turned out to be something else entirely, something considerably older and considerably stranger. What emerged from systematic survey and excavation was the outline of a massive walled city built primarily from stone, dating to roughly 2,300 to 1800 BCE. The site is called Shimao, and in the years since that initial reckoning, it has forced a quiet but significant reassessment of what was happening in northern China during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, a period that, in the standard historical narratives, was not supposed to contain anything quite like this. The scale of Shimao is the first thing that demands attention. The outer wall of the settlement encloses an area of approximately 4 square kilometers. The inner walled zone, a step pyramid structure at the site's heart that rises to about 70 meters in its current eroded state, crowns a natural stone outcrop that was shaped and built upon with deliberate and sustained effort over what appears to have been several centuries. The pyramid-like structure at the center, archaeologists refer to it as the palatial zone, contains evidence of elite residence, ritual activity, and craft production of considerable sophistication. Jade objects, turquoise, painted murals, and what appear to be the remains of human sacrifice have all been documented at the site. The combination is striking. This was not a simple defensive enclosure or a seasonal gathering point. Shimao was a city with all the complexity that word implies. The stone walls themselves are the focus of the Selcha stone settlement classification here, and they are worth examining in some detail. The walls were not built casually. They incorporated a system of bastions, projecting sections that allowed defenders to observe and engage threats along the wall's face, that appears sophisticated enough to suggest either independent development of advanced defensive architecture or contact with traditions that had already worked through those design problems elsewhere. The stone used in the construction was quarried locally from the same rocky terrain that the site occupies, and the builders clearly understood how to select and place stone for maximum structural effect. Sections of the wall have been excavated to reveal internal construction techniques that include the use of fill materials packed between stone faces, a method that increases stability and was used in various forms at fortified sites across Eurasia during broadly similar periods. But the walls at Shimao contain something that goes beyond engineering. Excavators found, embedded within the foundation layers of the Eastern Gate area, a collection of human skulls. Dozens of them, arranged in pits in a pattern that does not appear random. The prevailing interpretation is that these represent foundation sacrifices, rituals conducted during construction to consecrate or protect the walls. Similar practices are documented at other ancient sites across different cultures and geographies, which is itself an interesting pattern. But the scale and organization of what was found at Shimao suggests a ritual program of some deliberateness, not isolated acts. Someone planned this. Someone decided how many and where and when. The question of who built Shimao and what happened to them is genuinely open. The site does not fit neatly into the known cultural sequences of the region during this period. Some researchers have proposed connections to the later cultures of the Yellow River Valley. Others point to similarities with steppe cultures to the north and west. The jade and turquoise objects found at the site indicate long-distance trade or exchange networks reaching well beyond the immediate region. Shimao was not isolated. It was connected to something larger. The exact nature of those connections is still being traced. What happened to Shimao is also unresolved. The city appears to have been abandoned around 1800 BCE after several centuries of occupation. There is evidence of burning at the site, and some researchers have interpreted this as evidence of violent destruction. Others argue the burning was localized, and the abandonment was more gradual. The subsequent history of the region does not show a clear successor culture that claimed Shimao as an ancestor site, which leaves the city's legacy somewhat suspended. Impressive, documented, and genealogically orphaned in the historical record. A walled city of 4 square kilometers rising from the Mu'as Desert, built by people whose descendants we cannot confidently name. The stone walls stood for centuries before they fell. There is a place in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, at an elevation of about 2,900 meters, where the snow stays on the ground for most of the year and the wind is a constant physical presence. In that high, exposed place, someone arranged stones in a pattern on the ground, a central cairn, a circle of stones extending outward from it, roughly 25 meters in diameter, and from that central cairn, 28 stone lines radiating out like the spokes of a wheel toward the outer ring, with 6 smaller cairns positioned at specific points around the circumference. No walls, no roof, no shelter of any kind, just stones, placed with care on the roof of a Wyoming mountain at an altitude where the growing season is measured in weeks and the weather can turn life-threatening with very little warning. This is the Bighorn Medicine Wheel. It is one of the most studied and most debated stone arrangements in North America. And despite well over a century of formal research, beginning with the first systematic documentation by the anthropologist S.C. Sims in 1903, the full picture of what it is, who built it, when, and precisely why, remains stubbornly and fascinatingly incomplete. The dating question alone is complicated. There is no organic material embedded in the stone arrangement itself that allows direct radiocarbon dating of the wheel's construction. Estimates based on associated artifacts, oral traditions, and comparative analysis have placed its origin anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 years ago. The most commonly cited range among researchers puts the primary construction phase somewhere between 1200 and 1700 CE, though some elements may be older. The Crow people, whose traditional territory includes the Bighorn Mountains, have oral traditions connected to the site, and multiple other plains and mountain peoples consider it significant within their own cultural frameworks. The National Historic Landmark designation the site received in 1970 acknowledged its importance without resolving the questions about its origins. The astronomical dimension of the Bighorn Medicine Wheel is where much of the modern research focus has concentrated, and it is where the most specific and testable claims have been made. Beginning in the 1970s, astronomer John Eddy conducted a detailed study of the wheel's geometry and its relationship to celestial events. What he found was that several of the cairns positioned around the outer ring align, when viewed from specific positions, with the rising and setting points of the sun at the summer solstice. Other alignments he identified correspond to the heliacal rising, the first appearance above the horizon after a period of invisibility of three bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius. These stellar events, Eddy argued, could have served as a practical astronomical calendar marking the beginning and end of the short, high-altitude summer, the timing of important ceremonial gatherings, or the coordination of hunting activities tied to seasonal animal movements. Those findings have been both supported and challenged in the decades since. Some researchers have replicated and extended Eddy's work, finding additional alignments that strengthen the astronomical interpretation. Others have raised methodological concerns, pointing out that with a structure containing 28 spokes and 6 peripheral cairns, the number of possible alignment combinations is large enough that some significant-looking alignments may be coincidental rather than intentional. That debate has not been fully resolved, and it probably cannot be resolved through astronomical analysis alone. What the oral traditions of the peoples connected to this site offer is a different kind of evidence that formal archaeology has historically been slow to integrate but is increasingly taking seriously. The Crow name for the site and the stories associated with it convey an understanding of the wheel's purpose and significance that does not map neatly onto either the purely astronomical interpretation or the purely ceremonial one. It is both, and possibly more than both, in ways that the categories available to outside researchers don't fully capture. The Selkirk Stone Settlement Framework positions the Bighorn Medicine Wheel as one of the clearest examples in this series of stone used not to enclose or elevate or defend, but to mark, to inscribe meaning onto landscape at a scale and in a location that required deliberate effort to reach and maintain. The mountain doesn't make this easy. Getting to the wheel in the months when it's accessible requires real physical commitment. That commitment was apparently considered worthwhile, repeatedly, across generations. 28 spokes, 6 cairns, 1 central point. The geometry is simple enough to describe in a sentence. Understanding what it meant to the people who built it and returned to it across centuries is a different matter entirely. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, about 50 miles northeast of Beirut, there's a Roman temple complex called Baalbek. If you've seen pictures, you know it's impressive. 6 towering columns from the Temple of Jupiter, each one 62 feet tall, still standing after 2,000 years. Roman engineering at its finest. Tourists come from all over the world to see it. But the Romans didn't build the foundation. Underneath their temple, supporting the entire complex, is a stone platform made from blocks that shouldn't exist. Not with ancient technology, not even with modern technology, not really. The largest of these blocks weighs approximately 800 tons. That's 1.6 million pounds. A single stone. And there are dozens of them, fitted together so precisely that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. These aren't the biggest ones, though. About a quarter mile away, still in the quarry where they were cut, are 3 stones called the trilithon. Actually, that's not quite right. The trilithon is what they call 3 specific stones in the temple foundation. The ones in the quarry are even larger. The biggest one, called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs roughly 1,000 tons, 2 million pounds, cut from bedrock, partially freed from the quarry, and then abandoned. Here's where it gets interesting. We know the Romans didn't cut these. The stones were already there when they arrived, part of an earlier foundation that they simply built on top of. But who did cut them? The site has been occupied for thousands of years. Phoenicians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans. Everyone wanted to build there, but none of them claimed to have moved these particular stones. The Romans were exceptional engineers. They built aqueducts that still carry water, bridges that still hold traffic. The Pantheon's dome was the largest in the world for over 1,000 years. They knew how to move heavy objects. They wrote about their methods, left detailed records, but they never wrote about moving stones this size. Because they didn't. They found them already in place. Modern engineers have tried to figure out how it could have been done. Wooden rollers, they suggest. Thousands of workers pulling in unison. Ramps carved into the hillside. It's technically possible, on paper. In practice, wood crushes under that much weight. Ropes snap. Coordination becomes nearly impossible, and that's assuming level ground. The quarry is uphill from the temple site. Some researchers propose that the stones were never meant to be moved, that they were cut as a demonstration of skill, a sort of ancient engineering flex, and left where they were. But that doesn't explain the ones already incorporated into the foundation. Those were definitely moved. Somehow. There's another detail that doesn't get mentioned much. The cutting marks. When you look closely at where these stones were separated from the bedrock, you can see the tool marks. They're consistent with copper or bronze tools, which is what would have been available at the time we think they were cut. But copper tools shouldn't be able to cut limestone this efficiently. They'd wear out almost immediately. You'd need thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. The local tradition, passed down through generations, says the stones were placed by giants before the Great Flood. The Romans heard this story when they arrived. They didn't believe it, obviously, but they didn't have a better explanation. Neither do we, really. Not one that accounts for all the evidence. Baalbek remains an active archaeological site. New surveys happen regularly. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed there's more underground, structures we haven't excavated yet. Maybe those will provide answers. Maybe they'll just raise more questions. Either way, the stones aren't going anywhere. They've been sitting there for at least 2,000 years, possibly much longer. They'll still be there long after we're gone, waiting for someone to figure out how they got there in the first place. In the 1930s, the United Fruit Company was clearing jungle in southern Costa Rica to plant bananas. They were working in the Diquis Delta, near the Tairona River, when workers started finding something unusual. Spheres, perfect stone spheres, some small enough to hold in your hand, others taller than a person, just sitting there in the jungle, most of them partially buried, covered in centuries of vegetation. At first, the company saw them as obstacles. A few got destroyed. Someone started a rumor that they contained gold, so workers broke some open looking for treasure. They didn't find any. Eventually, archaeologists heard about the discovery and realized what they were looking at. Hundreds of carved stone spheres, possibly thousands originally, scattered across several square miles of what had once been settlements. The Diquis spheres, as they're called now, range from a few inches to over 6 feet in diameter. The largest ones weigh about 15 tons. They're made from gabbro, a type of igneous rock similar to granite. Hard rock, not easy to work with. And yet whoever made these achieved near-perfect sphericity. We're talking about deviations measured in millimeters, on stones that weigh several tons. How do you even start to make something like that? Modern stonemasons have tried to replicate the process using ancient tools. It's possible, technically. You rough out the basic shape with hammerstones, then gradually refine it, constantly measuring, adjusting. It takes weeks, months for the larger ones, and that's with modern measuring tools. The pre-Columbian people who made these didn't have calipers or levels or any way to precisely measure sphericity. Yet somehow they achieved it. We don't know who made them. The Diquis culture existed in this region from about 700 CE to the Spanish conquest in the 1500s. They didn't have a writing system, at least none that we've found. They left no records explaining the sphere's purpose. When the Spanish arrived, the people living there had no memory of how or why they were made. The knowledge had been lost, possibly centuries earlier. Archaeologists have found spheres arranged in patterns, lines, triangles. Some appear to align with astronomical features, though that's debated. Others seem randomly placed, though that might be because they've been moved over the centuries. Local farmers sometimes relocated them as property markers or decorative elements, not realizing their archaeological significance. What we do know is that they took tremendous effort to create. Gabbro doesn't exist naturally in the Diquis Delta. The nearest source is several miles away, in the Talamanca Mountains. These stones were quarried, shaped into rough spheres, then transported to their final locations, possibly by river. Once there, they were refined to their final precision. Why? We can only guess. Some researchers suggest they marked important sites, elite residences, ceremonial centers, places of political significance. That makes sense for some of them. The ones found near the remains of structures, but others were found isolated, in the middle of nowhere. No associated buildings, no artifacts nearby. Just a perfect stone sphere sitting in the jungle. Another theory involves astronomy. The people of Diquis were sophisticated observers of the sky. They tracked solstices and equinoxes, planned their agricultural calendar around celestial events. Maybe the spheres represented stars or planets. Maybe their arrangements mapped constellations. It's an attractive idea, but it's hard to prove. Too many spheres have been moved from their original positions. Then there's the simple explanation. Maybe they made them because they could, as demonstrations of skill, as art, as something beautiful in its perfection. Ancient people didn't need practical reasons to create monumental works. Sometimes the work itself was the point. Costa Rica has tried to protect what remains. Several spheres are displayed in museums. Others have been left in situ, protected as archaeological sites. But many were destroyed before anyone understood their significance. Blown apart with dynamite, broken up for building material, buried under modern development. We'll never know how many there originally were or see the complete patterns they formed. The Diquis spheres raise a straightforward question that doesn't have a straightforward answer. How do you create geometric perfection using Stone Age technology? We can replicate the process now. We understand the principle, but understanding something intellectually and actually doing it are very different things. These stones prove it was done. They just don't tell us how or why or what it all meant to the people who spent their lives making them. Off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, one of the Caroline Islands in Micronesia, there's a city built on water, not beside water, on it. Nearly 100 artificial islands constructed from massive basalt columns, connected by a network of canals. It covers about 200 acres of shallow reef flat. The locals call it Nan Madol, the place of spaces, or, in another translation, the space between. From above, it looks almost like a circuit board. Geometric islands arranged in patterns, rectangular enclosures, walls that form precise angles. But get closer and the strangeness becomes apparent. The walls are made from columnar basalt, hexagonal stone logs stacked crisscross like a massive stone version of a log cabin. Some of these columns are 18 feet long and weigh several tons each. There are hundreds of thousands of them. Nobody lives there now. The city was abandoned long before Europeans arrived. When Spanish explorers first heard about it in the late 1500s, it was already deserted, its canals choked with vegetation, its structures crumbling into the lagoon. The people of Pohnpei knew it was there. They had stories about it, but no one lived there anymore. No one had for generations. The current archaeological estimate dates Nan Madol's main construction period from around 1200 to 1500 CE. That's when the Sodelur dynasty ruled Pohnpei and used Nan Madol as their ceremonial and administrative center. But there's evidence of earlier occupation, structures that might date back several centuries before that. The chronology is unclear. Carbon dating of organic material gives us ranges, not precise dates. What we do know is that Nan Madol was an elite center. Not everyone lived there. The population was probably between 500 and 1,000 people, mostly priests and nobles. The common people lived on the main island, farming and fishing, bringing tribute to their rulers. The whole arrangement was designed to reinforce social hierarchy. The rulers literally set themselves apart, surrounded by water, elevated above everyone else. But here's the engineering puzzle. Pohnpei doesn't have a natural source of columnar basalt. The stone had to be brought from the other side of the island, from quarries near Soki's Rock, about 25 miles away by sea. Columnar basalt forms when lava cools slowly, creating those characteristic hexagonal columns. It's found in specific volcanic features. The builders didn't just find suitable stone nearby, they went looking for it. How did they transport it? There's no evidence of wheels or draft animals in ancient Micronesia. The prevailing theory involves rafts and canoes. Float the stones across the lagoon at high tide, then somehow lever them into position. But these aren't small stones, they're massive. Maneuvering them with ropes and wooden poles would require serious coordination, and they stacked them 25, 30 feet high in some places. The largest structure, Nan Duwas, has walls 40 feet high and 17 feet thick. Some local traditions say the stones flew through the air, moved by magic, that the Sodelur rulers commanded the stones to move themselves. Obviously, we can't take that literally, but it might reflect the seemingly impossible nature of the task. When something appears beyond human capability, magic becomes the explanation. The city's layout follows a deliberate plan. The southwestern area was for priests and religious rituals. The northeastern section housed the nobility and administrative functions. Specific islands served specific purposes. There was a place for food preparation, separate from living areas, a mortuary complex where the dead were prepared for burial. Everything organized, compartmentalized. The canals served as streets, boats as transportation. But here's something that doesn't get mentioned often. The canals aren't just functional. They're engineered to manage tidal flow. Pohnpei's lagoon experiences significant tides. The builders designed their canal system to work with the tides, not against them. Water flows in at high tide, flushes out at low tide, maintaining circulation. Without that circulation, the canals would have become stagnant, breeding grounds for disease. Whoever designed this understood hydraulics. Nan Madol was eventually abandoned. The reasons aren't entirely clear. The Saudalur dynasty fell, overthrown by a warrior named Yaxchilán, who came from another island. That's the legend anyway. After that, the new rulers chose not to maintain the city. Maybe it was too closely associated with the old regime. Maybe it was simply too expensive to maintain. Stone structures in a marine environment require constant upkeep. Let them go for a generation or two and nature takes over. Today, Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's protected, studied, slowly being mapped and documented. But it's also deteriorating. Seawater is gradually eroding the basalt. Mangrove roots work into cracks, prying stones apart. Climate change means higher sea levels, stronger storms. The city survived for centuries after abandonment. It might not survive the next century. What remains is evidence of ambition, of a society that mobilized enormous resources to create something monumental. They didn't have to build on water. There was plenty of land on the main island. They chose this location, chose this method, chose to work with materials that were difficult to transport and difficult to use. Why? Because they could. Because it made a statement. Because architecture is power made visible. In the winter of 1850, a powerful storm hit the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. The wind stripped grass from a large dune known as Skara Brae. Underneath, the landowner found something unexpected. Stone walls, rooms, furniture carved from stone. An entire village, perfectly preserved, under sand for roughly 4,000 years. This isn't a collection of huts or simple shelters. These are sophisticated houses with interior features that wouldn't look out of place in a much later period. Each home has a central hearth, stone beds with space for mattresses, dressers with shelves, built-in storage compartments, even a primitive form of plumbing, with drains leading from the houses to a waste system. All of this built around 3100 BCE, making it older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids. Skara Brae was inhabited for about 600 years, then abandoned suddenly. We know it was sudden because the residents left things behind: tools, pottery, jewelry made from bone and shell. You don't leave valuable possessions unless you're in a hurry. Something made them go, and whatever it was, they didn't come back. The village consists of 8 houses connected by low covered passageways. The whole complex could be sealed shut, protected from the harsh Orkney weather. That's an important detail. This far north, winter is brutal. Wind comes straight off the Atlantic, nothing to stop it. The builders understood that. They built semi-subterranean, using the earth itself as insulation. Smart design for the environment. The houses are remarkably similar to each other. Same basic layout, same furniture arrangement, same size, roughly 12 feet square. This wasn't a society with obvious class divisions. No chief's house, no larger or finer homes. They appeared to live as equals, or close to it. That's unusual for the Neolithic period. Most settlements show clear hierarchies. The people of Skara Brae were farmers and herders. They kept cattle and sheep. They grew barley and wheat. They also relied heavily on the sea, fishing and gathering shellfish. Analysis of their refuse heaps shows they ate a varied diet: fish, beef, mutton, grains, wild plants. They weren't starving. They were doing reasonably well. What makes Skara Brae so valuable to archaeologists isn't just its age, it's the preservation. Most Neolithic sites in Britain consist of stone monuments, henges, burial mounds, stone circles. Those are impressive, but they don't tell us much about daily life. Skara Brae does. We can see where people slept, where they prepared food, where they kept their possessions. It's intimate in a way that monuments aren't. The construction technique is worth noting. The walls are made from flat stone slabs, stacked without mortar. The stones themselves came from the local beach, split along natural fault lines by freeze-thaw cycles. No quarrying necessary, just collection and transportation. The roofs were probably made from timber, whale bones, and turf. Those materials have long since decayed, which is why the houses are open to the sky now. One of the houses is different from the others. House 7. It's not connected to the passage system. It's separate, sealed. When archaeologists excavated it, they found it had been used as a workshop: stone and bone tools, fragments of pottery, pigments for making paint. This was where craft work happened, where specialized objects were made. There's something else interesting about House 7. The door could be locked from the outside, not from the inside, like the other houses, from the outside. That suggests it wasn't just a workshop. Maybe it was also used to confine someone. Or maybe the lock served some ritual purpose we don't understand. The physical evidence is clear. The interpretation isn't. Why did they leave? The most common theory involves a sandstorm. The same dunes that preserved the village might have threatened to bury it while people still lived there. Evidence suggests sand was encroaching on the settlement in its final years. Maybe it finally became unlivable, but that doesn't explain why they left possessions behind. If sand was slowly burying the village, they would have had time to pack. Another possibility is social upheaval. New people arriving in Orkney with different ways of living, different beliefs. The residents of Skara Brae might have been absorbed into a larger population, their village simply abandoned as they moved elsewhere. That happens. Settlements get replaced. People adapt to new circumstances. What we're left with is a snapshot, a moment frozen in time. These people lived here, thrived here, then vanished. They left behind their homes, their tools, their carefully carved furniture. The sand covered everything. The village slept, and 4,000 years later, a storm woke it up again. Modern Orkney residents take pride in Skara Brae. It's one of the best preserved Neolithic villages in Europe. Tourists come year-round to walk through the houses, to imagine what life was like. But the site is fragile. Erosion threatens it. The sea is closer now than it was when the village was built. Every year, more of the coastline disappears. Eventually, Skara Brae might return to the sea. Another mystery buried, this time permanently. In northern Sardinia, about 6 miles from the town of Sassari, there's something that shouldn't exist. Not in Europe anyway. It looks like a ziggurat, one of those stepped pyramids you'd expect to find in Mesopotamia. But it's not in Mesopotamia. It's in Italy, and it's older than most of the ziggurats in Iraq. Monte de Codi. The name doesn't translate to anything particularly meaningful in Italian. It might be pre-Roman, possibly from the indigenous Nuragic language that was spoken here thousands of years ago. What we do know is that it's a platform mound roughly 90 feet long, 60 feet wide, and about 30 feet high at its current state. There's a ramp on the southeast side, angled at about 20 degrees, leading to the flat top. The structure was built in two major phases. The first phase dates to around 4000 to 3650 BCE. That's the Neolithic period, the Late Stone Age. Agriculture was well established, but metal tools hadn't been developed yet. Everything was done with stone, bone, and wood. The people who built Monte Diquis were part of what archaeologists call the Ossuary culture, known for their distinctive pottery and megalithic tombs. The original structure was smaller, a modest platform. Then, around 3000 BCE, they rebuilt it, made it larger, added the ramp, changed the orientation slightly. This second phase is what we see today, though much deteriorated. Why they rebuilt it isn't clear. Maybe the original structure was damaged. Maybe religious practices evolved and required a different architectural form. We don't know. What strikes visitors immediately is how much it resembles ziggurats from the ancient Near East. The stepped platform, the ramp, even the proportions are similar. But here's the problem. Monte Diquis predates the Mesopotamian ziggurats by hundreds of years. The earliest known ziggurat is at Eridu in Iraq, dated to around 2100 BCE. Monte Diquis is at least 1,000 years older, so either we're looking at parallel development, two unrelated cultures independently arriving at the same architectural solution, or there was contact we don't know about, some kind of cultural exchange across the Mediterranean and beyond. The problem with the contact theory is that there's no other evidence for it. No Sardinian artifacts in Mesopotamia, no Mesopotamian artifacts in Sardinia from this period. Just this one structure that looks remarkably similar to something built much later in a completely different part of the world. Around the base of Monte Diquis, archaeologists have found other features. A large stone slab with a circular hole carved through it. A limestone sphere about 2 feet in diameter. Several standing stones. These appear to have been part of the ceremonial complex, though their specific functions are unclear. The stone with the hole might have been used for liquid offerings. The sphere might have had astronomical significance, or not. Interpretation is difficult when you have objects but no context. The site was abandoned around 1800 BCE. Why? The easy answer is that the culture changed. The Ossuary culture gave way to the beaker culture, named after their distinctive pottery style. New people, or at least new ideas. Monte Diquis might have been associated with the old ways, the old gods. When those fell out of favor, the site was no longer maintained. But there's another possibility: climate. Around 2200 BCE, there was a significant climate event in the Mediterranean. Drought, crop failures, migrations, civilizations collapsed. The old kingdom in Egypt fell. Cities in Greece were abandoned. Sardinia wouldn't have been immune to these changes. If agriculture failed, populations would decline. Monumental structures would become impossible to maintain. What was Monte Diquis used for? The most obvious answer is religious ritual. The flat top would have been an ideal place for ceremonies visible to a large crowd gathered below. Similar platforms in other cultures were used for exactly that purpose. Priests would ascend the ramp, perform rituals at the summit, communicate with the gods or ancestors or whatever supernatural forces they believed in. But there's another theory: astronomy. The structure's orientation aligns with certain solar events, though not perfectly. Some researchers argue that it served as an observatory, a place to track celestial movements and mark important dates in the agricultural calendar. That would make sense. Neolithic farmers needed to know when to plant, when to harvest. The sun and stars provided that information. The problem with both theories is that they're not mutually exclusive. Religious sites often incorporate astronomical alignments. The division between science and religion is a modern concept. For ancient people, they were the same thing. Understanding the cosmos was understanding the divine. Marking the solstice wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Today, Monte is slowly being restored. Not rebuilt exactly. You can't rebuild something when you're not entirely sure what it looked like originally, but stabilized, protected. The Italian government recognizes its importance. It's one of the most significant Neolithic sites in the Mediterranean. Tourists can visit, walk up the ramp, stand where priests stood 5,000 years ago. What remains unexplained is the question of why. Why build a monumental structure like this in the first place? These people were farmers. They didn't have surplus labor sitting around idle. Building Monte would have required significant resources, time, effort, coordination. Someone had to organize the work. Someone had to convince or compel others to participate. That implies social complexity, hierarchy, leadership, all from a culture we know relatively little about. Monte stands as evidence that the Neolithic period in Europe was more sophisticated than we often assume. These weren't simple farmers scratching out a living. They were capable of monumental architecture. They had the social organization to complete large-scale projects. They thought about the cosmos, about their place in it, about how to connect earth and sky, and then, for reasons we're still trying to understand, they stopped. The ramp fell silent. The rituals ended. The structure crumbled. Until archaeologists arrived centuries later, asking questions no one left alive could answer. In the Taima Oasis region of northwestern Saudi Arabia, there's a rock that looks like someone took a saw to it. A clean, straight split running through a sandstone formation, separating it into two nearly perfect halves. The precision is striking. The cut appears laser straight, both sides smooth and parallel. But there are no saw marks, no tool marks of any kind. Just a split, as if the rock decided to divide itself. Al-Nasla, that's what it's called. The name doesn't tell us much about how it formed. This isn't an archaeological site in the traditional sense. There are no structures here, no evidence of habitation. But there are petroglyphs carved into the rock faces. Figures of animals, possibly humans, though weathering has made them difficult to identify. Those carvings suggest people noticed this rock long ago. They saw something significant in it. The first thing most people ask is whether it's natural. That gap, that perfect split, it doesn't look natural, it looks artificial. But geological surveys confirm it is natural. The question is how. The prevailing geological explanation involves differential erosion along a fault line. Sandstone is sedimentary rock, formed from compressed sand and minerals. It develops along layers called bedding planes. Sometimes there are weaknesses in these layers, faults, cracks. Water seeps into these weaknesses. In desert environments, that water freezes at night, expands, widens the crack. Over thousands of years, a thin crack becomes a split. That explains splits in general. What it doesn't quite explain is the precision of this particular split. The sides are smooth, parallel. The gap maintains a consistent width from top to bottom. That degree of uniformity is unusual even in natural formations. Another factor could be wind erosion. The Taimar region experiences intense winds. Sand carried by wind acts like sandpaper, gradually wearing away exposed rock. If wind patterns remained consistent over long periods, they could theoretically create smooth surfaces on both sides of an existing crack. But wind erosion typically creates curved surfaces, not flat ones. It polishes, doesn't cut. Some researchers have proposed that the split occurred recently, geologically speaking, that Al-Nasla was a single boulder until a few thousand years ago when a sudden fracture divided it. That would explain the freshness of the split, why it hasn't been smoothed or distorted by subsequent erosion. But what would cause such a fracture? Earthquakes are rare in this region. Temperature stress, thermal expansion, and contraction, that's possible. Desert temperatures can vary by 60 or 70 degrees between day and night. Rock expands when heated, contracts when cooled. Over time, that stress can cause fractures. The two halves rest on small stone pedestals. The rock isn't sitting flat on the ground. It's balanced precariously on bases that look too small to support the weight above them. This isn't unusual in desert environments. Wind erodes softer material faster than harder material. The pedestals are made of harder stone, or a different type of sandstone that resists erosion. The main rock body is softer, erodes more slowly, but still faster than the base. Eventually, you get this mushroom-like appearance. What's interesting is that both halves remained standing after the split. If the fracture happened suddenly, you'd expect at least some shifting, some collapse. But both pieces stayed balanced on their pedestals, perfectly upright. That suggests either the split occurred very gradually, or the rock's center of gravity was perfectly positioned over the pedestal even after splitting. Local Bedouin traditions hold various beliefs about Al-Nasla. Some say it marks a sacred spot. Others claim it has healing properties. There's a recurring theme in the stories that the rock was split by divine intervention, a demonstration of supernatural power. These aren't scientific explanations, obviously, but they reflect how striking this formation is. When people see something that appears impossible, they seek explanations beyond the ordinary. The petroglyphs add another layer. They're weathered, difficult to date precisely. Stylistically, they resemble rock art from the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods found elsewhere in the region. That would put them somewhere between 3000 and 1000 BCE, roughly. The artists who made them chose this specific rock. Out of all the sandstone formations in the area, they picked this one. Why? Maybe the split already existed and made the rock distinctive, a natural landmark. Or maybe the split occurred later, and the petroglyphs were added to an ordinary boulder that only became special afterward. Without more precise dating, we can't say. Modern Saudi Arabia has begun promoting Al-Nasla as a tourist destination. The kingdom is trying to diversify its economy, and archaeological tourism is part of that effort. New roads make the site more accessible. Interpretive signs explain what visitors are seeing. But there's always tension between preservation and access. More visitors means more wear, more potential damage. The rock has stood here for millennia. Increased foot traffic might accelerate its deterioration. What Al-Nasla represents ultimately is our need for explanation. When we encounter something unusual, something that appears to defy normal processes, we want to know why. Science provides answers based on geology, erosion, physics. Those answers are probably correct, but they often feel insufficient. A split rock is just a split rock until you see it in person, until you stand in front of it and try to wrap your mind around the precision involved. Maybe that's why ancient people carved it. Maybe they felt the same way we do. They didn't understand erosion patterns and fault lines, but they recognized something extraordinary. They marked it, made it sacred, ensured it would be remembered, and thousands of years later, we're still looking at it, still asking questions. Some mysteries don't need to be solved. They just need to exist. In the mountains of Asuka, in Japan's Nara prefecture, there's a stone that doesn't make sense. It sits on a hillside, partially buried, covered in moss and centuries of neglect. At first glance, it looks like a large boulder, natural, unremarkable. But look closer and you'll see something that changes everything. This rock has been carved, shaped, modified with precision that suggests advanced tools and careful planning. Masuda no Iwafune. The name translates roughly to Rockship of Masuda. It's a granite block, approximately 36 feet long, 26 feet wide, and 15 feet high. Those are the visible dimensions. Most of it is buried. Ground-penetrating radar suggests the buried portion extends several more feet underground. The total weight is estimated at 800 tons. What makes this rock extraordinary isn't its size. Large rocks exist. What matters are the features carved into it. On the top surface, there are two square holes, each about 3 feet deep, cut with perfectly flat sides and sharp corners. These aren't natural erosion patterns. They're deliberately carved. Nearby, there are linear grooves running along the surface, all parallel, all precisely cut. The holes are puzzling. They're too regular to be accidental, too carefully executed to be decorative. They serve a purpose, or served one once. But what? Some researchers suggest they were anchor points, places to attach ropes or beams. But anchor points for what? If you're trying to move the rock, you'd attach ropes to the sides, not cut holes in the top. If you're trying to mount something on the rock, there are easier ways to do it. Another theory involves water. The holes could have been cisterns, containers for collecting and storing rainwater. That makes more sense, functionally. But it raises another question. Why carve cisterns into a massive granite boulder when you could dig a well or build a reservoir more easily? The effort involved in creating these holes would have been enormous. Granite is one of the hardest rocks. Carving it requires specialized tools and tremendous patience. The Asuka period, which lasted from 538 to 710 CE, was a time of significant cultural development in Japan. Buddhism was introduced from Korea and China. Architecture became more sophisticated. Craftsmen developed advanced metalworking techniques. It's possible Masuda no Iwafune dates from this period. The carving quality suggests metal tools, which would have been available then. But there's no definitive way to date carved rock. Unlike organic material, stone can't be carbon dated. Local folklore offers various explanations. One story claims the rock is actually a ship turned to stone, petrified by the gods as punishment for some forgotten transgression. Another says it's the work of Oni, demons from Japanese mythology, known for their supernatural strength. These stories don't tell us what the rock really is, but they tell us something else. People have wondered about this rock for centuries. Long before archaeologists arrived with their instruments and theories, local residents knew something was unusual here. There's another carved rock nearby, about 200 yards away, smaller but also modified with straight cuts and geometric shapes. Some researchers believe the two are related, part of the same project or complex. Others think the connection is coincidental, that they were carved at different times for different reasons. Without inscriptions or artifacts clearly associated with either rock, we're left guessing. One of the more practical theories suggests Masuda no Iwafune was a quarry project that was abandoned before completion. Perhaps ancient stonemasons were in the process of cutting building blocks from this granite formation when something happened. The project lost funding. Political circumstances changed. The workers were called away to a more urgent task. They left behind this partially carved rock, and over the centuries, the original purpose was forgotten. That theory explains the holes and grooves as extraction marks, the beginning stages of separating sections of granite. It's plausible, but it doesn't explain why anyone would choose this particular location for a quarry. The rock sits on a mountainside, far from any known construction sites from that period. Transporting heavy granite blocks down the mountain would have been incredibly difficult. There are granite sources closer to where the material was actually needed. Another possibility involves astronomy. Several ancient carved rocks in Japan show astronomical alignments. They mark solstices, equinoxes, the rising or setting of specific stars. Masuda no Iwafune's orientation has been measured, and while there are some potential alignments, none are precise enough to be conclusive. It might have astronomical significance, or it might be pure coincidence. The grooves on the surface present their own mystery. They're parallel, evenly spaced, all the same depth. If they're decorative, they're remarkably restrained. If they're functional, their function isn't obvious. Some researchers suggest they were guides for saw blades, part of a plan to cut the rock into sections. Others think they might have channeled water, directing rainfall toward the square holes or away from them. Modern analysis has revealed something interesting about the carving technique. The edges of the cuts show marks consistent with wedge splitting. This is a method where holes are drilled in a line, then wooden or metal wedges are driven into the holes. The wedges are soaked with water, which makes the wood expand, or hammered repeatedly if metal, creating pressure that splits the rock along the desired line. It's effective, and it was used throughout the ancient world. But it still requires precision and considerable effort. The Japanese government has designated Masuda no Iwafune as a historic site. It's protected, maintained, accessible to visitors, but it remains enigmatic. Every explanation raises new questions. Every theory has gaps, and unlike many archaeological mysteries, this one doesn't have competing schools of thought, just a general uncertainty. No one's quite sure what to make of it. What we're left with is evidence of intention. Someone, at some point, invested significant time and resources into modifying this granite boulder. They had a reason, they had a plan, and then, for reasons we don't understand, the work stopped. Or maybe it didn't stop. Maybe what we see is exactly what was intended, and we simply don't recognize the purpose. Ancient people didn't always think the way we do. Their logic, their priorities, their reasons for doing things, those can be alien to us. We see the result without understanding the reasoning. Masuda no Iwafune sits quietly on its hillside, as it has for centuries. Moss grows in the grooves. Rainwater fills the square holes, and the questions remain unanswered. Mexico City is built on layers: Aztec temples beneath colonial churches, colonial buildings beneath modern high-rises. The deeper you dig, the older things get. And in the southern part of the city, in an area called Quiquilco, there's something that predates everything else: a pyramid. Not the stepped pyramids you associate with the Maya or Aztecs. A circular pyramid, one of the oldest in Mesoamerica, partially buried under volcanic rock. The Quiquilco Pyramid is approximately 390 feet in diameter at its base and stands about 60 feet high in its current state. It probably stood taller originally. The structure is circular with a flat top, built from river stones and clay in layers that created the conical shape. A ramp spirals around the exterior, allowing access to the summit. Or it did. Much of the ramp is destroyed now. What makes Quiquilco significant is its age. Radiocarbon dating places its construction between 800 and 600 BCE. That's older than the first pyramids at Teotihuacan, older than the rise of the major Maya cities. At the time Quiquilco was built, most of Mesoamerica was still pre-urban, small villages and farming communities. But here, someone organized enough labor to build a monumental structure. The site was occupied for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation lived here, expanded the settlement, maintained the pyramid. At its peak, Quiquilco might have been home to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Mesoamerica at that time. But then, around 100 CE, disaster struck. Zitula, a volcano about 6 miles to the south, erupted. Lava flows buried the southern portion of the city. Not quickly, probably. Volcanic lava moves relatively slowly, giving people time to evacuate. But it's relentless. It doesn't stop. It fills streets, surrounds buildings, hardens into rock. When it was over, a significant portion of Quiquilco was entombed under basalt, some of it buried under 25 feet of solidified lava. The survivors abandoned the site. There was no point staying. Much of the city was destroyed, and volcanic soil takes time to become fertile again. They migrated north, possibly to Teotihuacan, which rose to prominence around this same period. Some researchers believe Quiquilco's refugees helped populate Teotihuacan, bringing their knowledge and traditions with them. The pyramid itself survived relatively intact, though one side took some lava damage. For the next 2,000 years, it sat there, partially buried, forgotten. The Aztecs, who would later dominate the region, either didn't know about it or didn't consider it significant. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they saw only a hill covered in vegetation. No one realized what lay underneath. It wasn't until 1920 that archaeologist Manuel Gamio identified the mound as artificial. Excavations began slowly. The lava made digging difficult. You can't just remove solidified volcanic rock without heavy equipment. But gradually, the pyramid's shape emerged. The circular design became apparent. And with it came questions. Why circular? Almost every other major pyramid in Mesoamerica is rectangular with stepped sides. The circular design is rare, unusual. Some researchers suggest it reflects an earlier architectural tradition, something that was later abandoned in favor of the rectangular form. Others propose it had astronomical significance, that the circular shape related to solar observations or calendar tracking. The summit of the pyramid would have held a temple or shrine. Nothing remains of that structure. Whatever was built there has long since collapsed or been dismantled, but we can infer it existed from similar sites. Mesoamerican pyramids weren't tombs, unlike Egyptian pyramids. They were platforms for temples, places where priests performed rituals visible to crowds below. Excavations around the pyramid have uncovered residential areas, workshops, burial sites. The people of Quiquilco buried their dead with grave goods, pottery, jade ornaments, obsidian blades. This tells us something about their beliefs, their view of the afterlife. They thought the dead would need these things wherever they went next. One particularly interesting find was a system of canals. Quiquilco was built on the edge of an ancient lake, part of the lake system that once covered much of the Valley of Mexico. The residents engineered canals to manage water flow, control flooding, possibly for irrigation. That requires planning, organization, specialized knowledge. This wasn't a primitive society. They understood hydraulics. The circular pyramid at Quiquilco raises questions about the development of complex society in Mesoamerica. For a long time, archaeologists assumed major urban centers didn't arise until later, that the classic period civilizations like Teotihuacan and the Maya were the first true cities. Quiquilco challenges that timeline. It proves that urban life, monumental architecture, and social complexity existed earlier than previously thought. Today, the site is surrounded by modern development: houses, shops, roads. A portion of the pyramid has been excavated and is open to visitors, but much of it remains buried under lava. Archaeologists know there's more down there, more structures, more artifacts, more evidence of how these people lived. But excavating through volcanic rock is expensive and time-consuming. Most of Quiquilco will probably remain buried. There's something poetic about a city buried by a volcano, preserved in stone. Time stopped here in a very literal way. The lava flow marked an ending, the final chapter of a civilization that had thrived for a millennium. But it also preserved evidence that would have otherwise eroded away. The buildings, the artifacts, the layout of the city, they're all still there, frozen beneath the basalt, waiting. Quiquilco reminds us that history isn't a straight line. Civilizations rise and fall. They build impressive things, then circumstances beyond their control, natural disasters, climate change. They bring everything down. The people scatter, knowledge is lost, and centuries later, someone starts digging and finds evidence of a world that was forgotten. The pyramid survived. The people who built it didn't, but in a way, they're still here, in the stones they laid, in the streets they walked, in the ash and lava that preserved their city for us to find. High in the mountains of northern Peru, at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, there's a fortress that most people have never heard of. While tourists flock to Machu Picchu, another stone city sits relatively undisturbed, wrapped in clouds, guarded by geography. Cuelap, a massive walled settlement built by the Chachapoyas culture, the cloud people, centuries before the Inca arrived. The walls are what you notice first. They surround the entire settlement, running for nearly 2,000 feet in length, built from limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. The walls aren't just tall, they're massive, up to 60 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rise. This isn't defensive architecture in the conventional sense. These walls are making a statement. They're saying something about power, about permanence. Cuelap sits on a ridge at the edge of a cliff, One side drops away into a valley thousands of feet below. The other side faces the mountains, the only approach. And that approach is controlled by 3 narrow entrances, each barely wide enough for a single person. These entrances don't run straight through the wall. They're angled, turning, creating a choke point where defenders would have a significant advantage over attackers. The Chachapoyas built Cuelap around 500 CE and occupied it until the Inca conquest in the late 15th century. That's nearly 1,000 years of continuous habitation. The fortress contains over 400 structures, round buildings with stone foundations. The walls of these buildings were originally made from wood and clay, but those materials have long since decayed. What remains are circular stone bases, like footprints of buildings that no longer exist. Who were the Chachapoyas? We don't know as much as we'd like. They didn't have a writing system, or if they did, nothing survived. When the Spanish chroniclers arrived and asked the Inca about them, the Inca called them cloud people because they lived in the high cloud forests. The Spanish noted that the Chachapoyas were tall, lighter-skinned than most Andean peoples, fierce warriors who resisted Inca conquest for decades before finally being absorbed into the empire. The engineering required to build Cuelap is impressive. Every stone had to be quarried from nearby outcrops, shaped to fit, then hauled into position. The walls alone contain thousands of tons of limestone. At this elevation, the work would have been physically demanding. The air is thin, weather is unpredictable. Fog rolls in without warning. Rain is common. Yet they built something monumental, something meant to last. Inside the fortress, archaeologists have found evidence of daily life: grinding stones for preparing maize, pottery sherds, metal tools made from bronze. The Chachapoyas were accomplished metallurgists, creating decorative items and weapons from copper, bronze, and even some gold. They were also skilled weavers, though few textiles have survived the humid climate. One of the most intriguing structures at Cuelap is called El Tintero, the inkwell. It's an inverted cone-shaped building, narrow at the base and widening as it rises. Nothing else quite like it exists in pre-Columbian architecture. Various theories have been proposed. Some think it was a temple. Others suggest it was a solar observatory, though the architectural form doesn't obviously support that function. It might have been a storage facility, though for what, we can only guess. The defensive nature of Cuelap raises questions. Who were they defending against? The Chachapoyas controlled a relatively isolated region. Their main enemies would have been other Chachapoyas groups, rival communities competing for resources and territory. Warfare in the Andes often took the form of raids rather than conquest. Quick strikes aimed at capturing people or goods. The narrow entrances and massive walls would effectively deter such raids. But there's evidence that Cuelap wasn't purely military. This was a community. Families lived here. Children grew up within these walls. They farmed the surrounding hillsides, growing potatoes, quinoa, maize. They raised llamas and guinea pigs. They traded with other communities, exchanging goods along mountain paths that connected the cloud forests to the Amazon basin on one side and the coast on the other. When the Inca arrived in the late 15th century, they eventually conquered the Chachapoyas, though not without difficulty. The cloud people resisted, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. But the Inca were persistent, and they had numbers. Cuelap was occupied by Inca forces, though they didn't significantly modify it. They recognized its strategic value and used it as an administrative center. The Spanish conquest followed soon after. By the time Europeans arrived, Quilap was already in decline. Disease, particularly smallpox, had devastated native populations. Social structures collapsed. Many settlements, including Quilap, were gradually abandoned. The jungle began reclaiming the stone, covering buildings, splitting walls with root systems. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that outside world learned about Quilap. A local judge named Juan Crisostomo Nieto documented the site in 1843. But serious archaeological work didn't begin until the 20th century. Excavations have been ongoing since the 1970s, slowly uncovering more about the Chachapoyas and their impressive fortress. One of the challenges in studying Quilap is the climate. The constant moisture accelerates decay. Organic materials don't preserve well. What we know comes primarily from stone structures and the occasional artifact that survived in protected conditions. The rest, the textiles, the wooden objects, the everyday items that would tell us so much about how people lived, those are gone. Modern Peru has invested in making Quilap more accessible. A cable car system now carries visitors from the valley floor to near the fortress, a journey that used to require hours of hiking. Some archaeologists worry about the impact of increased tourism. More visitors means more wear on ancient structures, more potential for damage. But it also means more awareness, more resources for preservation. What Quilap represents is a sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization that developed independently in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. They built on mountaintops, in the clouds, where breathing is difficult and weather is harsh. They created a fortress that has stood for 1,500 years, and they did it with stone tools, human labor, and knowledge that was passed down through generations, but never written down. The fortress stands as testament to human determination, to the drive to build something permanent in an impermanent world. The Chachapoyas are gone now, absorbed into other populations, their language lost, their traditions faded, but their stones remain. And in those stones, we can see echoes of who they were. In central Mali, running for roughly 120 miles through the Sahel region, there's a sandstone cliff called the Bandiagara Escarpment. It rises between 1,500 and 2,000 feet above the surrounding plains. A massive geological formation created over millions of years. But geology isn't what makes it remarkable. What matters is what's built into the cliff face itself. Hundreds of ancient structures carved directly into the rock, clinging to vertical walls that seem impossible to access. The Dogon people live here now. They've occupied the escarpment for the past 600 years, building villages on the plateau, above, and in the valleys below. They're known for their complex cosmology, their intricate masks, their astronomical knowledge. But they didn't build the structures in the cliff face. Those were already there when they arrived, constructed by an earlier culture called the Telem. The Telem occupied the escarpment from roughly the 11th to the 15th century CE, though evidence suggests human presence in the area goes back much further. They were skilled builders who took advantage of natural caves in the cliff face, expanding them, connecting them, creating a network of dwellings and storage facilities that were, by design, almost impossible to reach. Why build so high? The practical answer is security. The Telem were farmers. They stored grain in these cliff structures, safe from raids, protected from floods during the rainy season. The elevation also provided natural climate control. Air circulates through the caves, keeping temperatures moderate. Grain stored here could last for years without spoiling. But accessing these structures presents an obvious problem. Some are 300 feet up, a sheer cliff face. There are no ladders, no visible stairs, no handholds carved into the rock. Yet somehow, the Tellem not only reached these locations, they did so regularly enough to make the structures functional. They carried building materials up. They transported grain up and down. They lived, worked, and died in places that seem utterly inaccessible. The Dogon have traditions about how the Tellem accomplished this. They say the Tellem could fly, or that they could leap incredible distances, bounding up the cliff like mountain goats. These aren't literal explanations. They're ways of expressing that the Tellem had abilities the Dogon themselves don't possess. What those abilities actually were is still debated. The most likely explanation involves rope systems. The Tellem would have used ropes made from plant fibers, possibly baobab bark, which is strong and durable. They could have anchored ropes at the top of the cliff, then rappelled down to the cave entrances. Or they might have used a more complex pulley system to haul materials and people up and down. Both methods are technically feasible, though both require significant skill and courage. Some structures show evidence of platforms that no longer exist. Wooden beams were inserted into holes drilled in the rock face, creating small ledges or walkways. These would have made access easier, providing intermediate stopping points during ascent or descent. But wood deteriorates. After 500 years in this climate, any wooden components have long since rotted away. Only the empty holes remain. The structures themselves vary in size and complexity. Some are simple caves, naturally formed and only minimally modified. Others are elaborate multi-room dwellings with walls built from mud bricks, wooden lintels over doorways, evidence of plastered and painted surfaces. The Tellem were accomplished masons and architects. They understood how to work with the available materials to create livable spaces in hostile environments. Archaeologists have found burials in many of these cliff structures. The Tellem buried their dead in seated positions, wrapped in textiles, placed in small caves or crevices. The dry climate preserved these burials remarkably well. Mummies have been found with skin, hair, and clothing intact. Analysis of these remains tells us about Tellem health, diet, and lifestyle. One unexpected discovery was the quality of Tellem textiles. Fragments of cloth found in the burial caves show sophisticated weaving techniques, multiple colors, complex patterns. These people were creating high-quality fabric using hand spindles and simple looms. Some pieces resembled textiles that wouldn't be out of place in much later periods. The Tellem culture eventually disappeared. Exactly why isn't clear. Climate change is one possibility. The Sahel region has experienced multiple droughts over the past millennium. If rainfall decreased significantly, agriculture would become difficult. People would migrate to areas with more reliable water. The Dogon themselves might have been part of that migration, moving into the escarpment after the Tellem left. Another possibility involves conflict. Oral traditions mention wars, raids by neighboring groups. The cliff structures, while defensible, weren't invincible. If a hostile force controlled the top and bottom of the escarpment, they could effectively trap the Tellem in their cliff dwellings. Without access to water and farmland, the population would be forced to surrender or flee. The Dogon have maintained some of the lower cliff structures, using them for ritual purposes. Sacred masks and ceremonial objects are stored in certain caves, accessible only to initiated members of religious societies. This creates preservation challenges. The structures have cultural significance to the living Dogon, which must be balanced against archaeological and historical interests. Modern rock climbers have attempted to reach some of the higher structures using contemporary equipment: ropes, harnesses, climbing shoes. Even with these advantages, the ascent is difficult and dangerous. The sandstone is brittle. Handholds crumble. The rock face is exposed to intense sun most of the day, making metal equipment too hot to touch. Yet the Telem did this routinely, without modern gear. What impresses archaeologists isn't just that the Telem built in these locations, it's that they built well. The structures have lasted 500 years or more. The masonry work is solid. The buildings are properly ventilated. Water drainage was considered. These weren't desperate people throwing up shelter in any available space. They were skilled builders, making deliberate choices about where and how to construct. The Bandiagara Escarpment was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1989, recognized for both its natural beauty and its cultural significance. But protection is complicated. The structures are spread over a huge area, much of it remote and difficult to patrol. Looting has been a problem. Artifacts have been stolen from cliff structures and sold on the international market. Textiles, pottery, even skeletal remains have disappeared. Climate change poses another threat. Rainfall patterns are changing. When rain does come, it's often intense, causing erosion and rockfalls. Several structures have partially collapsed in recent decades. Without intervention, more will follow. But intervention is difficult when the structures are hundreds of feet up, a cliff face in one of the poorest regions of Africa. What the Bandiagara Escarpment represents is adaptation. Human beings finding a way to survive in a challenging environment by using every advantage geography provides. The Telem looked at those cliffs and saw opportunity, security, storage, safety. They developed techniques to access seemingly inaccessible places. And they created a legacy that puzzles us today, not because we don't understand the principle, but because executing it required a level of skill and fearlessness that's hard to fathom. The Dogon continue living around and among these ancient structures, maintaining their own rich cultural traditions while respecting the legacy of those who came before. The cliffs endure. The structures cling to rock faces, slowly weathering but still present, still mysterious. And visitors who make the journey to see them can't help but look up at those dwellings and wonder how it was done and what it must have been like to call such a place home. In the foothills of the Bolivian Andes, about 75 miles southwest of Santa Cruz, there's a sandstone hill that has been carved, not decorated, not engraved with petroglyphs. Carved. The entire top surface of the rock, covering roughly 2.5 acres, has been sculpted into geometric shapes, channels, terraces, and symbols that defy simple explanation. This is El Fuerte de Samaipata, and it's one of the largest carved rocks in the world. The rock itself is a sandstone outcrop that rises abruptly from the surrounding landscape. It's been carved from multiple directions by multiple cultures over a period of at least 1,500 years. The earliest modifications probably date to around 300 CE. The most recent were made by the Inca in the 15th century, just before Spanish conquest. What we see now is a palimpsest, layers of carving overlapping and sometimes obliterating earlier work. The most prominent features are two parallel channels, each about 200 feet long, carved into the rock surface. They're precisely parallel, maintaining consistent width and depth. At one end, they connect to circular depressions. At the other, they terminate in rectangular cuts. The purpose isn't obvious. They don't appear to be water channels, though water does flow through them during rain. They might have had ceremonial significance, or they might have served some practical function we haven't identified. Near these channels, a series of smaller geometric shapes, triangles, rectangles, circles, all carved with straight edges and precise angles. Some are shallow, barely an inch deep. Others penetrate the rock several feet. The arrangement doesn't follow an immediately recognizable pattern, though some researchers have proposed that it represents a map, possibly of the local constellation of structures or settlements. There are also animal figures, a large carved feline, possibly a jaguar or puma, though weathering has made identification difficult. A serpent, its body undulating across the rock surface. These aren't naturalistic representations. They're stylized, symbolic. The cultures that created them weren't trying to make realistic sculptures. They were creating icons, representations that carried meaning beyond mere appearance. Adjacent to the carved rock, at slightly lower elevation, are the remains of buildings. These are Inca construction, no question. The masonry style is distinctively Inca, with precisely fitted stones and characteristic trapezoidal doorways. The Inca called this place a fortress, and the Spanish chroniclers adopted that name. But there's debate about whether it actually served a military function. The location has strategic value. From the rock, you can see for miles in multiple directions. Any approaching force would be visible long before it arrived. The surrounding terrain is rugged, making large-scale military movements difficult. If you wanted to control this region, establishing a presence at Samaipata would make sense. But the carved rock itself, those channels and geometric shapes, they don't serve obvious defensive purposes. Earlier cultures occupied Samaipata before the Inca. The Shanay people, indigenous to this region, were here first. After them came the Guarani, migrating from the lowlands. Each group left their mark on the rock, different carving styles, different symbols. Archaeologists can sometimes distinguish between layers based on weathering and technique, but it's not always clear who carved what. Spanish conquistadors arrived at Samaipata in the 16th century. They recognized its importance and briefly used it as a staging point for expeditions into the lowlands, but they didn't maintain it long. The region was remote, difficult to supply, and the indigenous population was hostile. The Spanish eventually abandoned Samaipata, leaving it to slowly deteriorate. For centuries afterward, the carved rock was known mainly to locals. Farmers grazed cattle on the surrounding land. Some of the Inca buildings were dismantled, their stones repurposed for other construction. Vegetation grew over portions of the carved surface, obscuring details. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists began systematic study of the site. One of the more intriguing theories about Samaipata suggests astronomical significance. Several of the carved features align with celestial events. The long parallel channels, for example, might track the path of the sun during equinoxes. Circular depressions could mark positions of stars or planets. The entire carved surface might function as a three-dimensional calendar, encoding knowledge about seasonal cycles and astronomical phenomena. This interpretation is appealing but difficult to prove. Many ancient sites show some astronomical alignments, often by coincidence. The human tendency is to see patterns, to impose meaning on what might be random. Without written records from the people who carved these features, we're left speculating about their intentions. Another theory focuses on the channels as pathways for ritual liquids. Many Andean cultures practice liquid offerings, pouring chicha or other substances as gifts to supernatural forces. The channels at Samaipata could have guided these offerings along prescribed paths, the liquid's journey itself forming part of the ritual. The circular depressions might have served as collection points or as locations where priests stood during ceremonies. What's certain is that Samaipata required enormous effort to create. Sandstone is relatively soft compared to granite or basalt, but carving acres of it with stone and metal tools is still a monumental task. The precision of some features suggests careful planning and skilled execution. Straight lines maintained over hundreds of feet, parallel channels that don't vary in width. This wasn't casual work, it was engineering. The site's modern name, El Fuerte, means the fortress, but local tradition also calls it the place of the moon or the sacred rock. These names suggest different interpretations of the site's purpose, reflecting the multiple functions it might have served over its long history: military outpost, ceremonial center, astronomical observatory, perhaps all of these at different times. UNESCO designated Samaipata a World Heritage Site in 1998, acknowledging both its archaeological significance and the threat it faces. Weathering is the primary concern. Sandstone erodes relatively easily. Rain wears away carved surfaces. Temperature fluctuations cause cracking. Every year, details are lost. Features that were distinct a century ago are now barely visible. Conservation efforts are underway, but they face challenges. How do you protect a carved rock surface that covers acres? You can't put a roof over it. You can't seal it behind glass. The best option is controlled access, limiting foot traffic, preventing people from walking directly on the most fragile carvings. But even that only slows deterioration. It doesn't stop it. What Samaipata represents is persistence. Different cultures, separated by centuries, all chose to modify this particular rock. Each saw something significant in it. Each invested resources in carving their own additions to what was already there. They were adding their voices to a conversation that had been ongoing for centuries, a dialogue in stone that we're now trying to understand. The carvings don't tell a straightforward story. They don't offer simple answers. Instead, they present us with questions, challenges to our understanding of what ancient people were capable of and what they considered important. Why carve channels into solid rock? Why create geometric patterns that can only be properly appreciated from above? What message were they trying to send, and to whom? We may never fully understand Samaipata. Too much time has passed. Too many cultures have overlaid their work on previous efforts. Too much has weathered away. But what remains is enough to tell us that something important happened here. People believe this rock mattered. They spent their lives modifying it, and their work endures, slowly fading, but still present, still raising questions, still waiting for answers that may never come. In the arid hills of southeastern Spain, about 11 miles from the modern city of Almería, there's a site that shouldn't exist, not in 3200 BC, not with that level of sophistication. It's called Los Millares, and when archaeologists first excavated it in the late 19th century, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. A fortified settlement with concentric walls, bastions, advanced metallurgy, and a necropolis containing dozens of elaborate tombs. This was Copper Age Europe. People were supposed to be living in simple farming villages, not building proto-cities with defensive architecture that wouldn't look out of place 1,000 years later. The site sits on a plateau between two rivers, the Andarax and the Rambla de Huechar, natural defensive position, steep slopes on three sides. But the people of Los Millares weren't satisfied with natural defenses. They built walls, multiple rings of them. The outer wall stretches nearly a mile around the perimeter, reinforced with at least 15 bastions, circular towers projecting from the wall at regular intervals. These aren't decorative. They're military engineering. Bastions allow defenders to create crossfire, covering every approach with overlapping fields of fire. Except these people didn't have bows that could shoot very far. They didn't have siege engines. So what kind of warfare were they preparing for that required this level of planning? The main settlement probably housed around 1,000 people at its peak, maybe 1,500. The houses were simple, circular stone foundations with mud brick walls and thatched roofs. There are remnants of streets, a basic layout, nothing extraordinary about the domestic architecture. But the fortifications tell a different story. Whoever designed these defenses understood tactics. They understood how to channel attackers into kill zones, how to create strong points that could hold even if the outer walls were breached. And it's not just the main settlement. Scattered across the hills surrounding Los Millares are at least 13 fortified outposts, smaller versions of the main fort, positioned on high ground, guarding the approaches. A defensive network. This is coordinated planning on a scale that shouldn't exist in Copper Age Iberia. But here's what really throws researchers. Los Millares was peaceful, or at least there's no evidence of warfare, no mass graves, no burned layers indicating the settlement was attacked and destroyed, no bodies with arrow wounds or crushed skulls. The fortifications are there, massive and undeniable, but they don't seem to have ever been used. So were they necessary, or were they symbolic? Some archaeologists argue that the walls were about prestige, not protection. That building elaborate fortifications was a way for the elite to demonstrate power and control labor. Look what we can make people build. Look how organized we are. The bastions and outposts weren't for defense, they were for display. Others aren't convinced. They point to the strategic positioning, the overlapping fields of fire, the careful integration of natural and artificial defenses. That's not for show. That's practical military architecture. Maybe Los Millares never came under sustained attack because the defenses worked. Because anyone considering a raid looked at those walls and decided to go somewhere easier. What's undisputed is the wealth. Los Millares was rich. The excavations have uncovered copper tools and weapons, including daggers and axe heads. The metallurgy is advanced for the period. They were smelting ore, casting metal, creating alloys. Copper sources exist in the nearby Sierra de Gádor, so they had access to raw materials. But more than that, they were trading. Ivory from North Africa, ostrich eggshells, amber from the Baltic. These people had connections across the Mediterranean and beyond. The necropolis sits just outside the walls. Over 80 collective tombs, called tholoi. These are circular stone chambers, covered by earthen mounds, some large enough to hold dozens of burials. The tombs have passageways, antechambers, sophisticated construction techniques, and the grave goods are remarkable. Carved stone idols, engraved pottery, personal ornaments, objects that suggest social hierarchy, specialized craftspeople, religious beliefs we can only guess at. One tomb in particular stands out, larger than the others, more elaborate. The passage is longer, the chamber more carefully constructed. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of over 100 individuals buried over centuries, along with ivory, copper, decorated ostrich eggs, ritual objects. This wasn't a tomb for commoners. This was where the elite, the rulers, the important families were laid to rest. So Los Millares had wealth, had organization, had contact with distant cultures. And yet, around 2200 BC, it was abandoned. The population declined gradually, then disappeared. The fortifications were left to crumble. The tombs were sealed and forgotten. Why? Climate change is the usual suspect. The region experienced a severe drought during that period. Rivers dried up, crops failed. Maybe Los Millares, with its 1,000+ inhabitants, simply couldn't sustain itself. The people dispersed, moving to areas with more reliable water sources. But that doesn't explain the fortifications. If the settlement declined due to environmental stress, you'd expect to see evidence of that stress in the final occupation layers. Desperate measures, changes in diet, signs of malnutrition. Instead, the abandonment seems almost orderly, like people made a decision to leave and carried through with it. There's another possibility, quieter, less discussed. Maybe Los Millares wasn't abandoned because of internal failure. Maybe it was because the world around it changed. The early Bronze Age was beginning. New technologies, new power structures, new trade routes. Maybe Los Millares, for all its wealth and sophistication, simply became irrelevant. The walls still stand, partially, eroded by 4,000 years of wind and rain. The bastions are crumbling. The outposts are barely visible. But the mystery remains intact. Deep in the Orăști Mountains of Romania, hidden among forests and steep ridges, there's a fortress that Rome couldn't ignore. Sarmizegetusa Regia, the capital of the Dacian kingdom, a mountain stronghold so formidable it took the full might of the Roman Empire 2 campaigns to bring it down. And even then, after the conquest, after the destruction, the Romans never fully understood what they'd found, because Sarmizegetusa wasn't just a military installation, it was something more, something that still doesn't quite make sense. The Dacians were a Thracian people who controlled much of what's now Romania and parts of Hungary. They spoke a language that's extinct now, left behind almost no written records. What we know about them comes mostly from their enemies, Greek historians, Roman generals, and the ruins themselves. Sarmizegetusa sits at about 4,000 feet elevation, accessible only by narrow mountain paths that wind through dense forest, natural defensive position. But the Dacians weren't content with geography alone. They built walls, massive rectangular blocks of limestone fitted together without mortar, using a technique called murus dacicus. The stones are cut with such precision that you can barely slip a knife blade between them. The walls are backed with timber and rubble, creating a composite structure that's both flexible and incredibly strong. Flexible enough to absorb the impact of battering rams, strong enough to withstand siege engines. The Romans found that out the hard way. Emperor Trajan invaded Dacia in 101 AD. 2 legions, auxiliary forces, the best military machine in the ancient world, and the Dacians held them off. The campaign ended in a negotiated peace, not a Roman victory. Trajan went home, built a monument celebrating his triumph. But the Dacians kept their capital. It took another invasion 5 years later with even more troops to finally break through. And when the Romans did, they found something unexpected. The fortress covered roughly 70 acres, but it wasn't all military. There were residential areas, workshops, storage facilities, and temples. Multiple sanctuaries built with the same precision as the defensive walls. One of them, the main temple, is circular, about 60 feet in diameter, made from massive blocks of andesite, a volcanic rock that's difficult to work. The floor is paved. The walls, what remains of them, show careful construction, precise angles, but it's the arrangement that catches your attention. The temple sits at the center of a complex of smaller sanctuaries and what appear to be astronomical observation points. Wooden pillars arranged in circular patterns, markers that may have tracked the sun's movement. The winter solstice, the equinoxes, the Dacians, according to classical sources, had a religious elite called the Tarabostes, priest nobles, men who combined spiritual authority with political power, and they were studying the sky. That's clear from the layout. But why? Religious reasons, certainly. Most ancient cultures tied their gods to celestial movements, but there may have been practical considerations too. Agriculture, determining when to plant, when to harvest. For a mountain people living at high elevation with a short growing season, getting the timing right would have been critical. The Romans destroyed it all. After the final siege in 106 AD, they systematically dismantled Sarmizegetusa Regia, knocked down the walls, burned the buildings. The temples were abandoned, deliberately desecrated. The population was killed or enslaved. Dacia became a Roman province, and the capital was moved to a new city in the lowlands, Sarmizegetusa Ulpia Traiana. The old mountain fortress was left to rot. But here's the strange part. Even in ruins, the site maintained a presence. Later inhabitants, probably Romanized Dacians, continued to visit the temples. There's evidence of ritual activity well into the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. People were still coming to this abandoned, partially destroyed site to perform ceremonies, to honor gods whose names we don't even know. What makes Sarmizegetusa Regia so frustrating is how little the Dacians left behind in terms of written records. We have a few words, proper names mostly, preserved in Greek and Latin texts. We have Trajan's column in Rome, with its spiral relief depicting the Dacian wars. But the column shows the war through Roman eyes, Roman propaganda. The Dacians appear as noble savages, brave but doomed. Their culture reduced to visual stereotypes. The archaeology tells a more complex story. The precision of the construction, the integration of religious and military functions, the astronomical knowledge. These weren't primitive mountain tribes. The Dacians had engineers, architects, a sophisticated understanding of both defensive warfare and celestial mechanics. And they had gold, lots of it. The mountains around Sarmizegetusa were rich in gold deposits, and the Dacians had been mining them for centuries. That's probably what attracted Roman attention in the first place. Not strategic concerns, not barbarian raids, just gold. After the conquest, Trajan hauled an estimated 500,000 pounds of gold and 1 million pounds of silver back to Rome, enough to fund building projects across the empire for decades. So maybe that's the real mystery of Sarmizegetusa. Not why it fell, but why it stood as long as it did. A mountain kingdom sitting on a fortune in precious metals, surrounded by empires that wanted those resources. The Dacians held out for centuries, built their temples, studied their stars, fortified their mountains, until Rome decided the cost of conquest was worth paying. Walk through the ruins today, and you can still see the precision. The cut stones, the temple foundations, the mountain mist drifts through what used to be sacred spaces. Eagles circle overhead. The forests have reclaimed most of it, but the stones remember, even if they're not telling. In West Africa, stretching across what is now Gambia and Senegal, there are stone circles, over 1,000 of them, spread across more than 12,000 square miles of savanna and woodland. They're called the Stone Circles of Senegambia, and they represent the largest concentration of stone circles anywhere in the world. More than Stonehenge, more than Avebury, more than any megalithic site in Europe. And yet most people have never heard of them. The circles vary in size. Some contain just 10 stones, others have 24 or more. The stones themselves are laterite, a type of iron-rich sedimentary rock common in tropical regions. They're shaped into rough cylinders, anywhere from 3 to 8 feet tall, weighing up to 10 tons each. Each circle is precisely laid out, the stones evenly spaced, creating nearly perfect geometric patterns. And there are so many of them, clusters scattered across the landscape, sometimes a dozen circles in a single location, other times just 1 or 2 standing alone in the bush. The most famous site is Wasu in central Gambia, 11 circles containing a total of 54 stones. The largest stone there is about 8 feet tall and weighs close to 10 tons. Stand in the center of one of these circles and you feel the weight of it. The deliberate arrangement. Someone put enormous effort into hauling these stones, shaping them, setting them upright. And they did it over and over again, 1,000 times. But here's what we know about who built them. Almost nothing. The archaeological evidence suggests the circles were constructed between the 3rd century BC and the 16th century AD. That's a huge span, almost 2,000 years, which means this wasn't a single culture or a brief burst of activity. This was a tradition, generations upon generations, maintaining the practice of building stone circles. And we know their burial sites. Excavations have found human remains buried within and around the circles, sometimes individual burials, sometimes multiple individuals in a single grave. The bodies were usually laid in an east-west orientation. No cremation, no elaborate coffins, just bodies placed in the earth, sometimes with grave goods, iron tools, pottery, beads, nothing extravagant, but enough to suggest these weren't paupers' graves. But that's where the certainty ends, because who was buried in these circles? Kings, priests, warriors, or were they communal graves, reserved for entire families or clans? The physical evidence doesn't tell us. The skeletal remains haven't revealed any obvious patterns in age, sex, or social status. Some circles contain the bones of children, others only adults. There's no consistency. And then there's the question of why. Why circles? Why laterite? Why this specific arrangement of stones? Other African cultures built tombs, pyramids in Nubia and Egypt, rock-cut chambers in Ethiopia, earthen mounds across the Sahel. But these people chose circles, precise, carefully measured circles. Some researchers have suggested astronomical alignments, that certain circles mark the solstices or equinoxes. There are examples of stones positioned to catch the first light of dawn on specific days. But not all circles show this. Many seem to have no astronomical significance whatsoever. So if some circles were calendars and others weren't, what does that mean? Were different circles built for different purposes? Or did the purposes change over time? There's also the question of scale. Building even a single circle would have required significant labor, quarrying the laterite, shaping the stones with iron tools, transporting them to the site, digging the pits, raising the stones upright. You're talking about dozens of people working for weeks, and they did this 1,000 times across 2 countries over nearly 2 millennia. That suggests organization, centralized authority maybe, or a widely shared religious belief strong enough to motivate communities to invest enormous resources in these projects. But we have no written records from the cultures that built the circles, no oral traditions that clearly explain their purpose. The modern populations in Gambia and Senegal have their own interpretations, but these are largely speculative, passed down through generations that lost the original meaning centuries ago. What's particularly striking is that the tradition eventually stopped. The last circles were built sometime in the 16th century, around the time European contact with West Africa was increasing. The Portuguese arrived. The Atlantic slave trade began. Societies were disrupted. Power structures changed. And the stone circles, whatever they meant, were no longer built. But they weren't destroyed either. There's no evidence of deliberate vandalism. No Christian missionaries toppling pagan monuments. The circles were simply left standing, abandoned. Local populations didn't maintain them, but they didn't tear them down either. The stones just stood there, weathering slowly in the tropical climate, gradually being swallowed by vegetation. It wasn't until the 19th century that European explorers started documenting them. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that serious archaeological work began. UNESCO designated 4 of the major sites as World Heritage Sites in 2006. Finally, international recognition. But recognition doesn't equal understanding. The stone circles of Senegambia remain enigmatic. We can date them. We can measure them. We can excavate the graves and analyze the bones. But we can't know what they meant to the people who built them. We can't hear the ceremonies that must have accompanied the burials. We can't understand the cosmology that motivated such sustained effort over such a long period. The circles stand in the savannah, some leaning, some still perfectly upright. The laterite has darkened with age. The land around them is cultivated now. Millet fields, peanut crops. Life continues as it always has, but the stones watch, silent witnesses to something we've lost. We've traveled from the tropical islands of Tonga to the wind-battered cliffs of Ireland, from the Mediterranean coastlines to the mountains of Romania, from the Neolithic villages of Cyprus to the stone circles of West Africa. Different cultures, different time periods, different continents, and yet they all share something. They all present us with evidence that challenges our assumptions about the ancient world. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the darkness of prehistory. They were engineers, astronomers, architects. They moved stones weighing dozens of tons without machinery. They aligned structures with celestial events, using nothing but observation and patience. They built defenses against threats we can't identify. They honored their dead in ways we can't fully comprehend. And they did it all without leaving us an instruction manual. That's what makes these sites so compelling. We can measure them, date them, excavate them, but we can't know them. Not completely. The Ha'amonga and Maui Trilithon still holds its secrets about whether it tracked the sun or marked royal power. Laquimada's blackened stones won't say whether the burning was attack or ritual. The Nuraxi of Sardinia stand silent about whether they were fortresses or temples or something we haven't even considered. Kirokitia's buried dead, with their weighted stones and missing skulls, raise questions about beliefs we can only guess at. Dunangus perches on its cliff, defended by thousands of stone stakes against an enemy that may never have come. Los Millares shows us wealth and sophistication in a time when neither should have existed. Sarmizegetusa Regia proved that even Rome's legions could be held at bay by people the Romans called barbarians, and the stone circles of Senegambia stretch across the landscape, a tradition maintained for 2,000 years, then abandoned without explanation. These aren't the monuments that make it into the textbooks. They're not as famous as the pyramids or as iconic as Stonehenge, but in some ways, that makes them more important, because they remind us how much we don't know. How many civilizations rose and fell without leaving written records? How many achievements were forgotten? How many questions remain unanswered? Archaeology is detective work without all the evidence. We find fragments, pieces, clues that sometimes point in contradictory directions, and we do our best to assemble them into narratives that make sense. But the ancient world doesn't always cooperate. Sometimes the stones just stand there, silent, stubborn, keeping their secrets. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe the not knowing is what keeps us looking, keeps us asking questions, keeps us humble about how much remains to be discovered. Because for every site we've explored tonight, there are dozens more, hundreds, scattered across every continent, hiding in forests, buried under cities, weathering away on mountaintops, waiting for someone to find them, to excavate them, to try to understand. The past isn't dead. It's not even past, as someone once said. It's right there, in the stones, in the foundations, in the walls and tombs and circles, speaking a language we're still learning to hear. Sleep well. And when you wake up, remember, the world is stranger than we think, older, more complex, full of mysteries that shouldn't exist, but they do. If you found yourself drawn into these mysteries, if you stayed with us through all 7 sites, do us a favor, hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates a good mystery. Someone who understands that history isn't just dates and names. It's questions, puzzles, stories that don't have endings yet. And maybe, just maybe, subscribe. Because there are more mysteries out there, more sites that defy explanation, more stories that need telling. The ancient world is waiting.